Chapter 5:12. There was another chapter before last night at 12 o'clock. The situation took a turn for the worse in the blink of an eye. When the red light that filled the sky suddenly erupted and slowly dissipated, the situation of the entire battlefield became incomparably clear. However, Cass Rodder's sudden disappearance from the battlefield still gave everyone a clear sense of astonishment. Tonight, more than one Invincible Realm expert died in the battle. But Cass Rodder's death gave everyone a different feeling. It might even be completely different. Cass Rodder was the god of war of Star State. He was an expert who was close to the peak of the Invincible Realm. He ranked in the top 10 of the divine list and held the murderous weapon Holy Punishment of Void. In this state, Cass Rodder might not be able to sweep the Dark World. But in the Dark World, he was absolutely fearless. No one expected him to fall here. And in such a strange way. A huge sense of confusion struck everyone's heart. It was not only Raphael, Mellad and Situtsangyue who were stunned. Even Paul, King Tong, Violet, Lagos, and even Patriarch Hastile, who had been taken care of by the occupation, were stunned. At this moment, regardless of friend or foe, everyone felt a sense of sympathy. Cass Rodder was the most important person to fall tonight. His death was destined to cause a great disturbance in the Dark World. Even Star State, which had been slowly increasing its national power in recent years, would be greatly impacted. Paul's expression was calm, but sweat flowed down the back of his head and into his collar. The weight of a murderous weapon was undoubtedly extremely heavy. Especially the Void Divine Punishment. Among the 12 malefic weapons, the Holy Punishment of Void was not the most powerful, but that was under normal circumstances. In the past 10 years, the Void Godly Punishment had not been fired even once. After accumulating energy for 10 years, the power of the Holy Punishment of Void was definitely far beyond its normal state. At such a close distance, if this spear fell on Paul, he would be seriously injured on the spot, or even completely lose his combat capability. He would need a long period of recuperation in the future to save his life, and it was still unknown whether he could recover or not. This was the most normal situation. But now, the great danger had completely disappeared in a way that no one could have imagined. Paul did not feel relieved. Instead, he suddenly felt uneasy. Until now, he finally saw the situation of the Dark World clearly. The Polar Ground Alliance collapsed. The balance of the four families was broken, which eventually led to the current chaos in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe affects the whole world. Now that the chaos in Eastern Europe had not been pacified, Rothschild had completely become enemies with all the major forces. If Rothschild won tonight, Rothschild would inevitably gather the Shadow Throne with the general trend. Kyle would join forces with the Violet Morton family and cooperate with the Eastern Church to take down the Vatican. If Rothschild failed tonight, the Vatican would definitely attack Rothschild fiercely when it increased the speed of devouring the Eastern Church. The situation had already reached this point. After shedding all pretense of cordiality, there was no possibility of reconciliation between the two sides. From another perspective, in the chaos of Eastern Europe, Western Europe was bound to fall into extreme chaos after tonight, no matter who won or lost. Now that Cass Rodder, the god of war of Star Nation, and Huan Kong, the lord of Fantasy World, had died here at the same time, the vast North America was equivalent to losing two pillars overnight. North America would not be peaceful anymore. The probing of outsiders and the internal battles would also be exciting. Further south, South America. Jiang Qinsong was expelled from the Jiang family of South America. The Heroes Club had lost Mitchell. It was foreseeable that South America would not be peaceful either. As for Asia. As for Tiannan, it was the battlefield of the Wang family of Beihai and the purgatory of Heaven capital. But the land of Tiannan was involved in the sites of Zhongzhou State, East Island, and Annan State. Inside East Island, Jifeng Sword Raining School and Wuji Palace were fighting against the purgatory of Heaven capital. Inside Zhongzhou State, the hidden danger of the Wang family of Beihai was becoming more and more obvious. With the rise of the Li family, the atmosphere in Zhongzhou State began to become strange. It was not until this moment that Paul was shocked to find that after the battle tonight, there was no pure land in the dark world. When all the superpowers began to become chaotic, some of the weaker ones would definitely feel that they had a chance to rise. After tonight, the whole dark world would fall into an incomprehensible chaos. Looking at the dark world in recent decades or even hundreds of years, it seemed that such a situation had never occurred. It was like the madness before the end of the world. The general trend had formed a vortex that swallowed the whole dark world with Eastern Europe as the core. There was no way to stop struggling in this vortex, whether it was people or forces. They could only go crazy hysterically. All of this was like a conspiracy without a purpose. Paul suddenly felt very cold inside. At this moment, at least tonight, Rothschild was already standing in the center of the vortex. The surging general trend was surging wildly. Under the general trend, Paul felt that he and even Rothschild were incomparably small. If all this was a conspiracy, then what did the person behind the scenes who made all this want? Paul's face turned a little pale unconsciously. "Brother." King Tong let out a soft cry. Bang! Countless rays of light suddenly bloomed in front of him. The brilliant and scorching light was spinning wildly in front of him. The silent battlefield was completely broken in an instant. The light of heaven of Patriarch Hostile kept condensing in his hand, and dozens of thick light pillars kept falling. The moment the light pillars lit up, the crazy killing intent had already rushed to Situ Tsanyue. A huge black shield appeared in front of Situ Tsanyue at the same time. The dark saint spear kept changing its shape in the violent light. Raphael could hardly communicate with Situ Tsanyue. The loud roar and ubiquitous attacks completely covered her in an instant. In the blazing white light, Violet and Lagos attacked at the same time, almost regardless of the cost. In such an obvious situation, everyone could clearly see one thing. If they killed Raphael and Situ Tsanyue, Reki City would be theirs. As for Mellad, who was the weakest, they didn't care about him anymore. The light completely drowned Raphael and Situ Tsanyue. The huge force fiercely hit the Dark Saint Spear, and Raphael could even hear the constant wailing of the Dark Saint Spear. In a hurry, Raphael's domain was opened with all his might. The world was silent for a moment, and Raphael quickly said, "Kill one first." Boom! Mellad attacked with all his might. He was originally standing behind Situ Tsanyue, but at this time, he took a step forward. Soft and pure light kept flowing out of his fingers. The light surged in the night sky and merged with the light of heaven. The pressure on the Dark Saint Spear was instantly reduced. The pure light formed a door in front of Raphael and Situ Tsanyue. The door turned into a wall, blocking all the attacks from all directions. The unique skill of the Vatican, refuge. Hurry up! The surging power crashed into Melad's body. Blood spurted out of Melad's mouth. His face was a little ferocious, and there was an obvious urge in his simple voice. In an instant, the Dark Saint's spear changed from a shield to a long saber. The long black saber spread wildly, and the pitch-black saber light instantly covered 100 meters. An incomparably sharp saber light shattered all the light in front of Hostile. The pitch-black saber light continued to move forward. It almost brushed past Hostile's body and directly slashed at Violet, who was the weakest among them. The saber light, which was dozens of meters long, locked onto Violet's figure. The domain and the saber light burst out at almost the same time. It was pitch black, but dazzling. This move was called Dark Gospel. This move was called Death Harvest. All the power surged out of Raphael's body as he took a step forward. Blood began to seep out of the pores on his body, but as soon as the blood appeared, it was completely evaporated by the high temperature of his body. Raphael's eyes were ferocious. This was his most extreme move at the moment. It erupted in an instant, and it was as if he was either dead or alive. The saber light was surging. Wherever the pitch-black edge passed, the night sky seemed to be split in half, and all the air was crazily squeezed toward the surroundings. The space was distorted to the extreme. In the dull roar, it continued to explode and burn. The flames fell from the sky to the ground. On the ground, the major forces were still fighting. As the flames fell, an invincible realm expert of the Violet family was instantly burned to ashes. Violet's body was completely stiff. It wasn't that she didn't want to move, but that she couldn't move at all. Everything about her had been locked by Raphael. The domain was his will, and the saber light was his power. In a desperate situation, this move had reached the perfection that Raphael had never achieved. Violet couldn't move her body, nor could she use the domain. This desperate move completely showed the absolute suppression of an expert in the middle of the divine list against an expert in the middle of the holy list. Raphael's eyes were scarlet, and he was completely crazy. Not long ago, Tribulation's desperate move was not completely fruitless. He used the most direct and most dangerous method to detonate a space that was completely out of control. Needless to say, he was injured, but in that uncontrollable and unpredictable space, Paul was also seriously injured. The most important thing was that his physical strength had been greatly consumed. During the period when he almost didn't do anything but was recovering his physical strength, it was the best opportunity for Raphael. Without Violet, their pressure would be reduced to a considerable extent. Then, they would have the hope of breaking out of the encirclement. Breaking out of the encirclement, Raphael gave a wry smile. He didn't even have time to sigh with emotion that the tables had turned. The saber in his hand had already been pressed down crazily. The saber slashed in the air. A crack could be clearly seen in the empty night sky. Raphael suddenly raised his head. In his sight, Paul stretched out his hand and grabbed at the air. Violet's body was suddenly torn by a huge force and pulled out of the domain. Without any hesitation, Raphael stabbed straight with his saber. Violet, who had gotten rid of the shackles, looked at Raphael with resentment and soared into the sky without hesitation. There seemed to be a meteor streaking across the distant sky. The meteor burned with flames and broke through the sky from the distant sky. Almost in the blink of an eye, a surging and violent force had filled the entire sky. And Violet had just risen. The falling meteor seemed to have found its target and directly crashed into Violet. The huge force brought up one storm after another, and the speed of the meteor suddenly accelerated. It was filled with killing intent, anger, and determination. Violet's pupils instantly widened. The meteor in her sight became clearer and clearer. At this moment, she could only scream, "No!" However, before he could finish his sentence, the meteor had already collided with Pooh. In Violet's sight, there was an extremely clear and profound figure. Bang! In Violet's incomparably shrill and desperate scream, the meteor rushed past her. Violet looked down at herself in a daze. The corner of her mouth moved. Puff! With a dull sound, her body was directly exploded by the huge force, and her whole body turned into a mist of blood. The meteor landed on the ground and looked at Paul quietly. King Tong was stunned for a long time before she suddenly exclaimed, "Arsis." Chapter 5:13. The battle in the sky and on the ground did not subside with Violet's death. Instead, it became even crazier. The ink-like shadows in Paul's hands condensed into a substance and turned into countless swords, rushing towards Raphael without any pause. Mellad stood together with Sititsanue. Under the suppression of Patriarch Hostile, the pure light in the sanctuary continued to shrink and was almost completely gone. King Tong's domain completely enveloped the battlefield in the air. The space around Lagos was constantly twisting, as if it was accumulating power. The fighting on the ground seemed to be never-ending. The elites of Rothschild had already arrived at the battlefield. The elites of the Morton family, the Violet family, and the Knights Templar were also fighting. The army of Wulan State still seemed endless. The Masters of the Vatican, the Dark Knights, the Holy Disarmament Corps, the Heroes Club, the Fantasy World, and the Men in Black were fighting with the enemy under the cover of the army of Wulan State. Thunder and raging fire kept breaking out in the crowd, and the momentum was terrifying. However, it was only a frightening display. The combined power of the major forces on the ground was definitely stronger than the allies of Rothschild. However, experts of the invincible realm kept falling, which made the cooperation of the superpowers extremely chaotic. In addition, when Violet first appeared, he slaughtered the experts of the superpowers, which made everyone fearful when fighting. 3 of the 7 deadly sins of the Dark Knights, who were famous in the Dark World, had died in battle. More than half of the Holy Disarmament Corps of the Vatican died. Mitchell was the first Invincible Realm expert to die, so the elites of the Heroes Club had almost been wiped out. Fantasy World and the Man in Black were completely out of their wits. They were only subconsciously fighting each other. Erisis's figure fell heavily to the ground. An energy wave visible to the naked eye spread out violently with him as the center. The bodies of several knights of the Radiance Knight Regiment closest to him were directly shattered. Some of Violet's broken bones and flesh slowly fell to the ground, but they were fiercely scattered by this force. King Tong's exclamation rang out, but no one on the battlefield seemed to notice this scene. It wasn't that she didn't notice it. To be exact, she was already numb to it. Mitchell, Huan Kong, Cass Rotter, Violet, the general trend of the Dark World had never stopped. But throughout the history of the Dark World for nearly 100 years, there had never been a war that could make an Invincible Realm expert so fragile and fall so easily. From shock to numbness, now everyone had gone completely crazy. Erisis's eyes were cold and ruthless. A berserk aura surged around him. He fixed his eyes on several Invincible Realm experts for the first time. Paul immediately sensed a huge pressure coming at him. Erisis's voice rang out, shaking the sky and spreading out majestically. This voice was loud and sonorous, and its dignity carried undisguised brutality and rage. Heresy. You, all guilty. Whoosh. Out of instinct, Raphael's power erupted in an instant. After temporarily getting rid of Paul's entanglement, he retreated without hesitation. He was the leader of the Knights of Darkness. His most well-known achievement in the Dark World was not how well he developed the Dark Knights, nor was it his past achievements that shocked the Dark World. The biggest thing he was known to have done was to be able to escape unscathed from Arsis after provoking the Pope in the European sanctuary. And that was the uncrowned Arsis. He knew how powerful Arsis was. Paul was also very powerful. Raphael didn't want to get involved in the battle between people of this level, not at all. His body glided through the air. Almost at the same time, Melad's body suddenly lit up. Countless pure flowing lights continued to condense. The defensive light wall in front of Melad was instantly thickened countless times and was completely indestructible. This was not Melad's refuge. It was the unique skill to upgrade the refuge. Divine protection. Arsis, who had taken action to share Melad's pressure in the blink of an eye, appeared directly in front of Paul the moment the light appeared. He had no domain. However, the torrential power tore through the sky in an instant and shattered the shadows. His figure looked extremely tall and majestic in the process of charging. He was like a god. He was the Saint War Angel of the Vatican. And now, he was the Saint War Angel in a state of fury. One punch. In an instant, as Arsis waved his fist, the void within a radius of thousands of meters suddenly exploded. The extremely terrifying power came from all directions with a crazy tearing airflow. The domain that King Tong had condensed with all her strength suddenly shattered. Paul's body became clear for a moment. The pure light suddenly bloomed. Arsis, who was surrounded by holy light, punched Paul again. There was still no domain. There was still no sword intent. Erisis's movements were extremely simple and straightforward. Every move of his was filled with crazy surging power. He ranked first in close combat in the Dark World. He didn't need the so-called domain. No matter whose domain he was in, as long as he got close, his surroundings would be his world. King Tong's domain was completely suppressed. Puff! A mouthful of blood spurted out of King Tong's mouth, and her face instantly turned pale. Paul's body flashed in an instant. The domain around him condensed and spread, and it condensed with the domain that King Tong had burst out again. The obscure and dark shadow was mighty, and even the light on Erisis's body seemed to be no longer pure. When the two of them joined forces, this was the perfect domain. In this domain, Paul was also at the peak of the invincible realm. Arisus's body rushed straight over. Straightforward. Simple. Violent. It looked very cumbersome, but it carried an unimaginable swiftness and fierceness. Shadow slaughter. The small shadow on Paul's body kept fluctuating, and his figure disappeared in an instant. The next second, Arsis turned around and hit him with his elbow without hesitation. Bang! It was like the most casual collision, but the solid space was like a fragile mirror that was shattered one after another. The light and the shadow were entangled wildly. A large area of the night sky turned into nothingness, and then fell into the purest darkness. Paul took 2 steps back. His face was slightly pale, but he steadied himself. Arisus's pupils shrank slightly, and he turned around and rushed to King Tong without hesitation. Paul was very strong. But King Tong was the key. King Tong's domain completely made up for the weakness of Paul's domain in the state of shadow slaughter, and then made his combat capability reach the peak of the invincible realm, which was not inferior to Arisus's. As long as he killed King Tong, Arsis was 100% sure that he could kill Paul tonight. The shadow fluctuated slightly. Paul seemed to have crossed the space and appeared directly in front of Arsis. Leg sweep. Forward punch. Throat lock. Around the back. In the shadow domain, Paul's body had completely turned into a dark optical fiber. His figure seemed to appear in all directions of Arsis at the same time, and the cold killing intent burst out from the trickiest angle. Arsis didn't dodge or evade. He attacked head-on, and all of Paul's attacks were taken by him. Forward. His footsteps were extremely firm. In Paul's crazy attack, he went straight forward and rushed to King Tong. Buzz. A buzzing sound suddenly rang out in the void that had become extremely chaotic but had become incomparably quiet. Red light suddenly appeared. The blade of Ghost Hand appeared in front of Arsis almost in the blink of an eye. Bang! Arisus's body suddenly twisted, and he smashed his fist on the blade of Ghost Hand. The light that almost dispelled the whole night burst out in an instant. Arsis suddenly roared, and endless light burst out around him. The light that was condensed to the extreme suppressed the perfect domain created by Paul and King Tong. The shadow was retreating. The light was moving forward. It was so difficult to move forward and backward, but it obviously existed. A unique skill. The forbidden spell of heaven. This was a domain. But it was not Arisus's own domain. It was the strongest domain in the Vatican for hundreds of years, and it could also be said to be the most powerful unique skill. This was the unique skill of His Majesty Monlier, the greatest pope of the Vatican hundreds of years ago. Once the forbidden spell of heaven reached its limit, it had the terrifying power to kill someone at the peak of the invincible realm in an instant. At the peak of this unique skill, the Vatican even had clear records that its power was infinitely close to that of the Chosen One. Arisus's strength was far inferior to that of His Majesty Monlier in the past. But at this moment, this forbidden spell of heaven was already the domain of the peak of the invincible realm, and it was also his strongest trump card outside of close combat. End the battle as soon as possible. Tonight had brought Arsis too many surprises and humiliation. He didn't want to waste time with anyone. As long as King Tong died, everyone would die. Arsis roared wildly. A lot of blood flowed down from his body, but the situation that broke out soared again. Another ray of light that was slightly dimmer but equally pure shot over from afar. Unique skill, commandment of light. Under the circumstances that he couldn't reveal his true strength, this was Melad's strongest move. The pure light completely combined with the forbidden spell of heaven. The difficult and barely balanced balance was completely broken in an instant. The faces of Paul and King Tong changed dramatically at the same time. The situation of the whole battlefield was instantly reversed. Paul, King Tong, Lagos, and Hostile. 4 invincible realm experts. Arsis, Mellad, Situtsanyue, and Raphael. They were also 4 invincible realm experts. But in the case of Arceus fighting 1 against 2, Lagos and Hostile's combat capability was almost equal to that of Raphael and Situtsanuez. Mellad, the weakest invincible realm expert on the surface, suddenly became the key to the key. The commandment of light and the forbidden spell of heaven were completely combined, and it was extremely perfect. Arceus's eyes were cold. The infinite light instantly soared, almost drowning everything. All the shadows disappeared in an instant. Arceus stamped his feet hard. Go to hell, all of you. The strong light tore through the sky. The void within a radius of a kilometer had been completely illuminated. In the night of Reki City under the heavy rain, it was as if a bright sun had suddenly risen. The light swept past. Paul's body was suddenly sent flying for nearly 100 meters, and a mouthful of blood spurted out of his mouth. King Tong was covered in blood, and her aura plummeted. Arceus took a step forward. In an instant, a silver edge suddenly lit up in the aftermath of the light. The silver edge was so small in the aftermath of the mighty light. But it was so sharp. The sword light was hidden. The combination of sword intent and sword energy was incomparably perfect. The focused and sharp light tore apart the mighty aftermath of the light in an instant. The sharp sword edge stabbed straight at King Tong. The sword light arrived in an instant. Sea-breaking style. Be careful. It's Li Tianlan. Paul suddenly roared crazily. But the silver light that suddenly appeared was like a meteor. Just as King Tong wanted to dodge, the long sword had already come to her face. Puff. With a slight sound, the blade directly pierced through King Tong's body. Blood spurted out. At the same time, an earth-shattering roar completely suppressed the chaos on the battlefield. Snowdance Core. Charge. Outside the battlefield, in the darkness farther away, a figure, who had been hiding outside the perception range of the invincible realm experts, also stepped out of the darkness. Chapter 5:14. Blood flew out under the silver light, and the scarlet blood light looked extremely sad. This sword strike came suddenly. It was not earth-shattering, but it had an extremely condensed penetrating power. The remaining forbidden spell of heaven and the Shadow Kingdom were directly torn apart the moment the sword edge swept past. The silver light flashed away. As soon as Paul's roar sounded, the silver sword light had directly passed through King Tong's body, going through her front and back. Blood spurted and fell down. King Tong's figure was also falling. The silver flowing light bloomed and gathered, pushing King Tong's body to the ground. Wherever the silver sword light passed, the remaining domain was shattered. But the shattering was extremely small. As the sword light passed, the domain slowly closed again. This sword strike was like a light spot in the darkness. It was small, subtle, but bright, dazzling, and extremely perfect. King Tong's body fell hard to the ground. The messy battlefield suddenly shook, and countless cracks appeared on the ground centered on King Tong. Blood almost flowed out of control from the corners of King Tong's mouth. She moved her body, but she couldn't get up. The sword edge of falling stars pierced through her body, and the edge went through the middle of her chest and abdomen, straight and sharp. Although this sword was not aimed at a vital point, the edge of the sword had firmly nailed her to the ground. King Tong's body trembled slightly. At this moment, she was covered in blood and dust, looking extremely dirty and embarrassed. But her eyes were still arrogant and angry, and her demeanor did not seem to diminish at all. Li Tianlan's figure appeared beside her. He was dressed in a military uniform and stood tall and straight. How could you? King Tong's voice was hoarse and weak. Obviously, she did not expect that Li Tianlan's injury had basically recovered. Not only her, but no one had expected that Li Tianlan's current combat capability had reached such a terrifying level. The timing of the sword strike just now was perfect. The sword energy was sharp, and the sword intent was superior. Obviously, Li Tianlan, who had recovered quickly after being seriously injured, did not lose his foundation as rumored. Instead, he went further. In this state, Li Tianlan was no weaker than those experts on the holy list who were ranked at the bottom. And he was not really in the invincible realm yet. Li Tianlan took a step forward with a calm expression and said in a calm tone, "I kindly invited you to the office of the president as a guest, but you refused, so I had to come here in person." Boom! A loud boom suddenly erupted in the distant sky. In the blink of an eye, the night sky within a 1,000-meter radius was completely illuminated. Light and shadows collided. As soon as King Tong was attacked, Paul almost did not hesitate to burst out all his power. The completely different light shone in the night sky and turned into colorful colors. It was gorgeous and dangerous, like a miracle. In the colorful night sky, blood sprinkled down along with the night rain. Paul seemed to have gone completely crazy. Shadow carnage seemed to have made his speed countless times faster. His figure was less than 2 meters away from Arsis. The two of them had almost given up all defense and were fighting desperately. The void above the sky was chaotic and turbulent. Colorful rays of light kept bursting out. As the two of them passed through the night sky, a dazzling rainbow suddenly appeared in the chaotic night sky. This was almost the peak battle in the dark world. Even someone as strong as Mellad would find it difficult to participate without exposing his true strength. Li Tianlan squinted at the sky. It was not until this moment that he was completely sure of the true strength of the Patriarch of Rothschild. Arsis was obviously stronger than Paul. But there seemed to be something wrong with him now. His comprehensive strength had barely reached the peak of the invincible realm. Li Tianlan couldn't see the effect of the Pope's coronation at all. After Paul left the domain of King Tong, his strength did decline, but the decline was extremely limited. Although Arsis had an advantage over Paul in his normal state, his advantage was extremely small. To put it in an exaggerated way, it was negligible. Arisis's only advantage was that his physical strength was still abundant, while Paul's physical strength was greatly consumed. However, in the current state, Arsis couldn't do anything to Paul for a while. On the contrary, Paul's body movement was extremely strange and the angle was tricky. When the two of them were almost the same in strength, Li Tianlan was surprised to find that Arsis had the possibility of failing miserably. He was not surprised that an expert at the peak of the invincible realm fought in close combat. The most helpless thing was that although Li Tianlan was very strong, it was obvious that he couldn't participate in a battle of this level at all. "You will regret it, Li Tianlan. As long as I don't die, sooner or later, you will regret everything you did tonight." King Tong's voice sounded in Li Tianlan's ears. It was hoarse and weak, and it sounded extremely resentful. "Do you think I don't dare to kill you?" Li Tianlan glanced at her. "Why don't you try?" King Tong sneered, and her voice was as cold as ice. If Li Tianlan wanted to kill her with that sword just now, he only needed to move a few centimeters closer, and she would definitely die. But Li Tianlan didn't do that. King Tong immediately figured out the key to the problem. Wang Tianzong did not appear on the battlefield tonight. But even the imprisoned Sword Emperor could still exert his will that could affect the general trend outside the battlefield. A very strange light flashed in King Tong's eyes. Her mouth seemed to move, and she closed her eyes. Boom! There was a sudden clap of thunder in the sky above the heavy rain. Pale lightning flashed across the sky. Above the sky, the two battlefields had gone completely crazy. Arsis and Paul were still entangled. Mellad, however, had already turned around and joined another equally critical battlefield. Situ Tsangyue and Raphael were already covered in blood. Opposite him, Hastile and Lagos were equally disheveled. But with the addition of Mellad, the whole scene was slowly turning around. The two battlefields above the sky were getting closer and closer. The dazzling light crisscrossed the sky and the ground. The situation, which had been tilting toward Rothschild, was pulled back bit by bit. Li Tianlan looked calm, but his eyes were getting more and more serious. Even though his combat capability had improved after the date of death, he was still the weakest in the battlefield of the invincible realm tonight. The battlefield of Paul and Arsis was merging with the battlefield of Situ Tsangyue. In such a situation, it was hard for him to know what he was doing. And for him, the biggest threat at the moment was no longer the several invincible realm experts on the other side, but, bang! An extremely dull explosion that seemed to be able to shake everyone's soul suddenly sounded without warning. Li Tianlan's heart sank in an instant. The battlefield on the ground, which was not as vast as the one in the sky but more tragic, suddenly rose with endless red light. This scene was so familiar that everyone felt like they had seen it before. Li Tianlan was even more familiar with it. This was the light of the devil troop. The red light spread wildly in the crowd with an incomparably distinct shock wave. The scarlet all over the sky swept everything in an instant. Wherever the light passed, the army of Wulan State, the elites of various forces, and even the Snowdance Corps were cleared in an instant. The whole street seemed to become empty in an instant. Li Tianlan's eyes instantly focused and he rushed directly in the direction of the explosion. After Qin Weibai's explanation, he had already understood what the so-called devil troop was. A group of walking corpses who used to be in the invincible realm was not the most terrible thing. The most terrible thing was that their bodies were transformed by the materials of murderous weapons. They could control the murderous weapons in an instant. The materials of the murderous weapons in their bodies could naturally store energy like the murderous weapons. Perhaps the only difference was that the devil troop could not be used indefinitely. But they could also explode. This group of walking corpses without much consciousness, to be precise, were small murderous weapons that could move. Li Tianlan no longer cared about the battlefield in the sky. Because the advantage had gradually expanded and become obvious. As the battle came to an end, dealing with the devil troop of the Wang family of Beihai was his most important task tonight. Boom! The moment Li Tianlan approached the devil troop, the two battlefields in the sky finally completely merged together. Chapter 5:15. The battlefield in the air had reached the most critical moment. But the fiercest fighting on the ground suddenly became silent. Only the red radiance continued to spread silently. The elites of the major forces kept roaring with their mouths open. Countless troops of Wulan State retreated in horror. But there was no sound. The sudden burst of light seemed to plunder everything, suppressing countless noises and turning them into silence. Wherever the red light passed, it melted and destroyed everything. Ordinary soldiers and elites of the ice-condensing realm disappeared quickly the moment they came into contact with the red light. Even many experts of the fire-flaming realm fell to the ground under the erosion of the light of the murderous weapon. They gradually decayed and eventually turned into nothingness. The most complete nothingness. The red light slowly passed. All the people shrouded in the light had disappeared. The wind and rain were chaotic, and there was an empty space. Even the most basic ashes were not left. Everyone's heart was extremely cold. Tonight, Reki City was a huge meat grinder. Corpses were everywhere, and blood flowed like a river. The experts of the invincible realm died one by one. The people on the ground had long been ready to die in battle. But no one had seen such a strange death. They didn't know what was going on. The unknown was often scary. Under the great fear, the battlefield on the ground suddenly froze for a moment. In an instant, the red light in every corner of the battlefield burst out in a continuous stream. Endless raging fire and thunderbolts burst out in the crowd. If one only looked at the power, these flames and thunderbolts were not so amazing. At best, they were the power of the fire-flaming realm and the thunder-shocking realm, which was ordinary. But what was really frightening was the rhythm of the release of the flames and thunderbolts. This was a real outbreak. It broke out regardless of the consequences. The blazing fire rose into the sky. The thunderbolts were swirling in all directions. One after another, there was no pause. There was a red light in every corner of the battlefield. The red light was surrounded by flames and thunderbolts. Everyone could see that this was a person's attack. However, the raging flames and exploding thunderbolts were boundless and endless. Every time the opponent attacked, it seemed that he didn't need to gather strength at all. The violent rhythm pushed the terrifying heat to the peak in an instant. From a distance, it looked like the experts of the invincible realm kept bombarding with the power of the fire-flaming realm. This kind of power almost disregarded one's realm. Any martial artist had to accumulate power before making a move. Even if the charging time was very short, the process still existed. The other party seemed to be in the fire-flaming realm, but in an instant, an ordinary thunder-shocking realm expert in the fire-flaming realm could only make one move. However, the other party had already combined the power of several moves and smashed it. In an instant, the power of their one move was several times that of others in the same realm. The red light kept blossoming. The entire battlefield was torn apart by the explosion of fire and lightning. The invincible and even invincible Snowdance core was melting rapidly. However, the iron-blooded warriors did not retreat at all. Instead, they moved forward in silence. There were no more than 2,000 elites of the Snowdance Corps that Li Tianlan brought to the battlefield. The moment the red light burst out, almost one-third of them were gone. There was no power that could stop the devil army from converging. High up in the sky, the wind and clouds surged. The roar of several invincible realm experts shook the sky. The few red lights on the ground finally converged at one spot, completing the assembly. The sword light arrived. The silver light instantly drew a natural arc of light in the sky. The arc of light was no longer faint. The sharp sword energy cut through the sky and continued to stretch in the distant night. The silver light surged and burst out. Wherever the sword edge of falling stars passed, the whole night sky was like a mighty Milky Way, flying down. All the gathered devil army looked up at the silver light in the sky almost at the same time. The silver light was 100 meters long and roared down. Shattering style. Someone in the devil army at the front took a step forward. The red light suddenly changed. The silver light rose. Almost in the blink of an eye, the silver light of the devil army and the sword light had gathered together. Falling stars trembled slightly in Li Tianlan's hand, with a clear sense of resistance. However, falling stars, which had not been fully charged, was not spiritual enough. The sword was finally swung down, but its power suddenly dropped a lot. With the mighty silver light, Li Tianlan landed in the crowd. The next second, a crazy and high-pitched dragon roar suddenly sounded in the night. Dragon Fist. Countless blue lightning bolts exploded with Li Tianlan as the center. The lightning bolts kept appearing, turning into blazing white, and finally turning into translucent light. One after another, dragon shadows roared wildly around Li Tianlan. Several eyes fell on Li Tianlan at the same time. They were extremely stiff, but in unison. Without any hesitation, the moment their eyes met, the surging power turned into a violent flow and broke out completely. The extremely strong fire and lightning pressed directly from all directions. The dragon-shaped lightning around Li Tianlan was torn apart and reorganized, and a pair of fists with absolute power directly punched out at the moment when countless lightning bolts surrounded him. In the dazzling light and shadow, there was only an expressionless face in front of him. Li Tianlan punched. He also punched. The dragon roar was extremely high-pitched. The fists of the two collided in an instant. Li Tianlan's body shook violently, and the joints all over his body made a sound. The dragon roar was completely deformed. The soldier of the devil army on the opposite side was directly sent flying nearly 20 meters by this punch and smashed into a pile of ruins not far away. Smoke and dust rose all over the sky. The ruins shook for a moment, and the soldier of the devil army who had been blown away walked out again. One of his arms had fallen powerlessly. But his face was still expressionless. There was no retreat, no hesitation, no shock. His footsteps were getting faster and faster. In the entanglement of lightning and flames, several people of the devil army had completely formed a hole and rushed toward Li Tianlan fearlessly. The dragon-shaped lightning around Li Tianlan was startled and formed a pseudo-domain. But the pseudo-domain was completely torn under the first charge of several soldiers of the devil army. Countless flames and thunderbolts completely surrounded Li Tianlan, and the terrible power rushed into his body through every corner. Puff! Li Tianlan's face turned pale, and he suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood. But his eyes became sharper, and he didn't flinch at all. He punched. Dragon fist, dragon fighting in the wild. In the almost deafening dragon roar, the elites of all the major forces all rushed over. There were his own people of the Dark Knights, allies of the Vatican and the Heroes Club, and enemies of Rothschild and the Knights of Light. It was chaotic. The scene was completely chaotic. The enemies and his own people kept crossing each other in front of Li Tianlan. The Devil Army seemed to have completely locked him as a target, rushing all the way. Lightning and raging fire broke out almost non-stop. Countless attacks also fell on them at the same time. But every member of the Devil Army was expressionless. Their bones were broken, their flesh and blood were flying, and their bodies were bleeding. In the endless attacks, every member of the Devil Army was covered in blood. But no one took a step back. Every time the lightning and raging fire rolled, there would be a large number of casualties. Only 5 members of the Devil Army appeared, but they were like one, advancing and retreating together. Li Tianlan couldn't find any chance to kill one person alone. And when the 5 people attacked at the same time, even Li Tianlan, he could only avoid the attack for the time being. "Your Highness, let your troops follow me." A thin old man appeared beside Li Tianlan and said with a ruthless expression. While he was speaking, a few figures with extremely powerful auras were also approaching him at the same time. "I'm guilty." The old man's tone was a little ferocious. "I can take people to separate them." "Your Highness, if you have a chance, kill one first." The Devil Army gave people a terrible feeling. Under such circumstances, with their combat effectiveness, they could even overturn the battlefield of tens of thousands of people in the end. Even if they only killed one, the pressure on them would be much less. And if they could kill one, they could naturally kill the second. Li Tianlan nodded. The next second, Li Tianlan's orders sounded in the ears of the remaining 1,000 or so elites of the Snowdance Corps at the same time. The chaotic occupation suddenly changed. The Dark Knights took the lead. The torrent of the Snowdance Corps gathered directly toward the Devil Army. The remaining elites of the Men in Black and the fantasy world blocked the Knights of Light. The Vatican held up Rothschild. Sin replaced Li Tianlan as the leading figure. The Dark Knights and the Snowdance Corps gathered together. Charge! Under the constant eruption of countless thunderbolts and raging fire, the elites of the Dark Knights rushed in without hesitation. The Snowdance Corps followed closely behind. It was mighty. The Devil Army began to charge at the same time. The raging fire and thunderbolts began to gather. The moment the two sides collided, blood suddenly flew all over the sky. The 5 members of the Devil Army were directly scattered for a moment under the desperate charge of the Dark Knights and the Snowdance Corps. A member of the Devil Army was drowned in the torrent of the crowd. Li Tianlan suddenly took a step forward. Dragon fist, flying dragon in the sky. His figure rushed into the sky, and a punch fell directly. In the monstrous killing intent, countless dragon-shaped thunderbolts constantly gathered on Li Tianlan's fist. Li Tianlan's figure fell straight down. The member of the Devil Army, who was left alone, looked up at Li Tianlan. He seemed to know that he was no match for Li Tianlan. Without any hesitation, he directly chose the most decisive way. His eyes suddenly lit up with a red light. The red light rose into the sky. But the shadow fell from the sky. A gray shadow, which was so thick that it looked like a substance, pressed down from the sky in a mighty manner. The shadow was very high. It was even above the battlefield of the invincible realm. On the battlefield, Paul's figure instantly became more flexible. Everyone raised their heads at the same time. In their sight, King Tong, who should have been seriously injured and withdrawn from the battlefield, reappeared at the highest place of the battlefield. Her aura was stronger. In an all-out state, the dense and dark Shadow Kingdom directly fell down and pressed down on the battlefield of the invincible realm. Boom! In the earth-shattering noise, all the experts of the invincible realm were falling. The two battlefields in the sky and on the ground completely merged together in the blink of an eye. At the same time, countless red lights burst out and enveloped the entire battlefield. Chapter 5:16. The great change came suddenly. The battle situation was so chaotic that no one could predict it. Li Tianlan's brain froze for a moment. Everyone in the sky and on the ground was a little stunned. The devil troop on the ground was really tricky. This group of former invincible realm experts were willing to be transformed. With the foundation and technology of the Wang family of Beihai, they had really transformed them into real devils. The walking dead. They seemed to be alive but not dead. They seemed to be dead but not dead. Their bodies had been implanted with murderous weapon materials from the very beginning. That touch of spirituality seemed to have gradually replaced their souls. The perennial ice kept them in a relatively good fighting state. Such devils were destined not to live for a long time once they were born. But when they entered the fighting state, they were a truly invincible force. There was no pain, no thoughts, no vital points. There was no vital point. When the foundation of the invincible realm was combined with the murderous weapon, it completely became an unknown destructive power. And such a destructive power was called a devil. According to Qin Weibai's speculation, there would be no less than 24 members of the devil troop. Li Tianlan even suspected that if all the members of the devil troop attacked together, even Wang Tianzong would have to flee. Now Li Tianlan was facing only 5 people. He couldn't use his sword. Any attack was completely ineffective against them. They rushed up at the same time. Li Tianlan, the youngest expert with the combat capability of the invincible realm in the dark world, didn't even have the ability to fight back. The elites of the Dark Knights saw this. Therefore, the Dark Knights and the Snowdance Corps divided the battlefield without hesitation. The 4 demons, whose eyes were glowing with red light, didn't even spare a glance at their separated comrades. The moment the crowd surrounded them, raging flames and lightning exploded. Blood splattered everywhere, and the cold massacre didn't stop at all. The lone devil's arm was just broken by Li Tianlan's punch. Although there was no pain, it was a fact that he couldn't lift his arm. He would not be Li Tianlan's opponent if he fought alone. So he didn't move. There was no thunder or raging fire. He looked up at Li Tianlan with red light in his eyes. In an instant, there was only red light left between heaven and earth. Li Tianlan could even clearly feel the scarlet heat in the other party's pupils. Falling stars was restless on his wrist. On the ground, the light in the devil's pupils turned fiery red, like a little bit of magma, constantly boiling. It was at this moment. The shadow suddenly fell. Li Tianlan felt the aura of King Tong. His mind went blank for a moment. He abruptly retracted the dragon fist that was charging forward with an indomitable will and quickly retreated. He did not kill King Tong. Although the sword didn't stab King Tong's vital parts, the sudden outburst of sword intent was enough to make King Tong completely lose all her fighting capacity. He didn't dare to touch Wang Tianzong's bottom line, so this was the result. But he didn't expect that King Tong could still move. The shadow was extremely dense, and the powerful aura was mighty. The domain that was close to the peak of the invincible realm perfectly merged with Paul's domain. For a moment, it actually suppressed the light of Situ Tsanyue, Raphael, and Arcis. There was no doubt that King Tong's injury had completely recovered. Even his physical strength had been completely restored. King Tong was now an expert who was close to the peak of the invincible realm. Only the highest end gene potion could make an invincible realm expert recover his combat capability quickly. There were only a few kinds of potions that could achieve this effect in the entire dark world, and they could be counted on one hand. Rothschild didn't have such technology. Neither did the Shadow Throne. But the Wang family of Beihai did. Wang Tianzong gave the potion, which meant an extra life for an invincible realm expert, to King Tong. Li Tianlan was a little confused. If he could get hold of the evidence of this kind of transaction, he could even directly confirm the fact that Wang Tianzong had committed treason. He was tempted for a moment, and then he thought that King Tong had this kind of potion. Did Paul have it? His heart turned cold again for a moment. In a trance and confusion, King Tong, who had tried her best to condense her domain, screamed and fell. The shadow completely covered her in the blink of an eye. On the ground, the red light in the eyes of the devil who was alone suddenly burst out completely. It was like flowing magma. The night between heaven and earth suddenly burst into a fiery red. This was the purest light, without any substance, but with a kind of power to destroy everything. The eyes of the devil who was alone burst open. His body also burst open. Boundless flames flew out unscrupulously. Li Tianlan's heart suddenly felt a little cold. He subconsciously thought of the short moment when he fought with the devil troop. From the moment the devil troop was divided to the present. From the beginning to the end, the devil troop was silent and did not rescue him. And the devil who was alone also did not ask for help. The moment he was sure that he was no match for Li Tianlan, he directly detonated his eyes without the slightest hesitation. Indifferent, ruthless, straightforward, and decisive. This was a real war machine. There was no sacrifice, no life and death. The red light and the shadow kept alternating. The anxious battle was instantly interrupted by the terrifying explosion. Even Arsis and Paul flew back at the first time. The huge shock wave swept everything, and the fiery red light kept hovering in the sky. Within the range of the red light, everyone below the thunder-shocking realm was completely melted the moment they touched the light, silently. The scene was silent and horrifying. Li Tianlan was in a trance. Everyone was in a trance. This was the devil troop. And their eyes were undoubtedly the place where the materials of the murderous weapons were stored. Therefore, although the opponent's dying blow was different from the full blow of the murderous weapons, its nature was the same. This was the real devil's eye. The violent explosion, with a loud sound that shook the sky, kept sweeping everything around it. The Snowdance Corps and the Dark Knights were forced to disperse. The extreme chaos did not stop at all. The red light flickered slightly in Li Tianlan's sight. In the fighting crowd, several different domains were formed in an instant. The domain of King Tong was still solid and condensed. The light of the forbidden spell of heaven swept in all directions, but there was always a shadow around Paul. The two of them had become two shadows that even Li Tianlan could hardly distinguish. The extremely dangerous collision sounds were extremely dense. The power of the two of them fighting tore the space apart. As they moved, the elites of the surrounding forces and the army of the Snowdance Corps were all shocked into blood mist by the violent power. Mellad did not help this time. It seemed that ever since the red light of the devil troop had appeared, he had become timid. He kept a distance from a few devils and hesitated to move forward. His attitude had changed very subtly. However, on the entire battlefield, Mellad was timid. His role had suddenly been reduced by countless times. Two devils of the devil troop had already appeared beside Situtsanyue. The majestic domain kept hovering around Situtsanyue. Between the two evil demons' attacks, there was a continuous stream of fire and lightning. The huge destructive power quickly nibbled away at Situtsanyue's useless heaven and earth. The sword energy in the domain was flying fast. The two devils were already covered in blood, and even their bones could be seen. But their speed was getting faster and faster. Raphael was very close to Situtsanyue, but it was too late for him to rescue her. Lagos and Hostile's attacks were completely crazy. It was obvious that they wanted to kill Raphael first to break the situation. The Dark Saint's spear once again turned into a shield. The huge shield completely surrounded Raphael's body. Lagos and Hostile, the two invincible experts on the divine list, attacked together, but Raphael focused on defense. Unexpectedly, they could not break through Raphael's defense. The remaining two demons rushed directly in front of Li Tianlan. Without any nonsense, the crazy and uninterrupted attack suddenly whistled to him. With the addition of the devil troop, a new balance was formed in the situation that was constantly being pulled apart. Li Tianlan's eyes were gradually filled with scarlet streaks of blood. The new balance was so fragile. And fragility often meant being out of control. Li Tianlan suddenly became extremely angry. Absolute anger completely overwhelmed all his reason in an instant. Here. It was Reki City. It was the place occupied by the Snowdance Corps. He had an absolute advantage in strength, but now everything had become like this. He was even ready to face failure. Rothschild was the enemy he had to deal with. He might kill him, but he did not dare to kill him. Their huge advantage had gradually been obliterated. Mitchell died. Huan Kong died. Cass Rotter died. Tribulation withdrew from the battlefield with serious injuries. Qin Shilai withdrew from the battlefield with serious injuries. But now he still had to face the endless power of his opponents. The drugs of the Wang family of Beihai. The devil troop of the Wang family of Beihai. The bottom line of the Wang family of Beihai. F*CKU. Why? This was Reki City that the Snowdance Corps had conquered. Wasn't it Reki City in Zhongzhou State? The only difference was that this would not be Reki City of the Wang family of Beihai. Was this the reason why you stopped me? Why? In the thunder and fire, Li Tianlan turned his head and glanced in the direction of the office of the president. The light and shadow were dazzling. It was raining cats and dogs. The street lights were dim. The office of the president was faintly visible. But he could clearly sense that the will of Sword Emperor Wang Tianzong was watching this place with an unparalleled sense of oppression. Li Tianlan's eyes suddenly turned red. You can't stop me. He thought silently. No one can stop me. Puff. A mouthful of blood sprayed out of Li Tianlan's mouth with extreme anger. His face instantly became extremely ferocious. Get lost. An extremely loud dragon roar suddenly resounded throughout the battlefield. Li Tianlan strode forward. The densely packed dragon's shadows turned into bolts of lightning. His figure broke through the thunder and rushed into the fire. He waved his fist. Dragon fist and azure dragon arrow. In an instant, there was a piercing sound in the air. Li Tianlan's figure was completely straightened. His punch seemed to drive his whole body and flew directly to the nearest member of the Devil Corps. Bang! The fist with great power collided with the opponent's arm. At the same time, another devil's fist directly hit Li Tianlan's back. Li Tianlan's face suddenly turned pale, but he ignored it. Dragon fist and azure dragon hammer. The sky tens of meters above the horizon suddenly changed shape. The dragon silhouettes that were whistling around him converged into one, turning into an incomparably ferocious giant hammer. Li Tianlan's arm fell. The shadow of the giant hammer also fell. Boom! The whole street shook under the huge impact. As strong as the devil was, he also lost control of his body in this turbulent power and flew up directly. Before his body landed on the ground, Li Tianlan had already grabbed his ankle. The thunder and fire had completely surrounded Li Tianlan. The devil whose ankle was grabbed by Li Tianlan suddenly rotated, and the other foot directly swept over with enough power to break the space. The attack of another devil fell wildly on Li Tianlan's back. Li Tianlan threw the devil in his hand out. The crazy sword intent completely enveloped his figure. Blood spurted from the devil's body. His body was torn apart, but no bones could be seen. In Li Tianlan's sight, what was exposed under the devil's skin and flesh were pieces of alloy shining with mysterious luster. Li Tianlan ignored it. The devil's body crashed into a collapsed ruin. The next second, a large piece of ruins suddenly flew up. Li Tianlan's figure directly rushed over. Huge stones, broken glass, and broken steel bars were suddenly completely lifted into the sky. Li Tianlan's fists were all condensed with white thunder to the extreme. The devil troop was very strong. But Li Tianlan was fast enough. In an instant, he completely gave up all defense. His fists shining with thunder were like a storm, constantly smashing on the devil's body. Bang! The mysterious alloy in the devil's body was completely broken under the continuous bombardment of great power, and the devil's legs were broken under Li Tianlan's crazy attack. Eternal destruction sunset. An extremely dry and mechanical voice suddenly sounded behind Li Tianlan. In an instant, the eyes of the devil with only half a body in front of Li Tianlan suddenly burst out a scarlet light, as if it had heard some mysterious command. Boom! The remaining half of the devil's body suddenly burned. But it was burning with red fire. The red flame kept burning in his half-body. In the blink of an eye, the devil became a man of fire. The devil who had been chasing Li Tianlan and attacking him suddenly retreated. Only a voice sounded in Li Tianlan's ear, "He just ate an eye." Li Tianlan didn't realize what had happened. His wrist suddenly tightened. Falling stars was constantly twisting in his hand. The red flame on the devil's body burned on falling stars without warning. Li Tianlan's face changed. His sword intent surged and completely wrapped falling stars. At the same time, the burning devil rushed directly to Li Tianlan and held his body with both hands. He rushed forward. His strength increased several times in an instant. He held Li Tianlan and rushed directly to the invincible realm battlefield. Boom! A little farther away, endless red lights suddenly burst out. That was Situtsanyue's battlefield. In the next second, the red light in front of Li Tianlan continued to expand. Bang! An incomparably scarlet explosion, which was no less powerful than a real murderous weapon, suddenly sounded in front of Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan blacked out. He didn't lose consciousness. Instead, a huge shield that was big enough to completely wrap his body suddenly appeared around him. The shield quickly shrank around him and finally turned into an armor. Raphael, who had lost the Dark Saint spear, was instantly covered by the attacks of Lagos and Hastile. Blood spurted out of his body crazily. At the same time, on the edge of the battlefield, a figure who had wanted to appear on the battlefield but retreated finally took a step forward this time. Last time, he took a step forward with his left foot. But this time, it was his right foot. Different directions, different choices. An extremely ferocious big spear appeared in his hand. He raised the spear. In an instant, the night sky was dim. One of the 12 murderous weapons in the dark world. The twilight of the gods. The twilight of the gods of the Heroes Club. Charlemagne, the president of the Heroes Club, finally came to the battlefield at the last moment of the war. But this spear was not aimed at Paul. It was Arcis. Boom! The dim yellow light in the sky gathered into a ray of light. The next second, it directly penetrated Arcis's body. Arcis's body suddenly shook and he lowered his head in disbelief. The next second, Paul had already rushed over and kicked Arcis away. The scene became completely silent in an instant. Situtsanyue fell down. Raphael fell down. Arcis was hit head-on by the murderous weapon and fell down. On the entire battlefield, there were only 2 people left on Li Tianlan's side. He still had Mellad. Paul's eyes turned and fell on Mellad. Mellad touched his nose and suddenly laughed. "I think I can surrender." The corner of Li Tianlan's mouth twitched. He was silent for a long time. Now, he was really the only one left. He glanced at Charlemagne, the president of the Heroes Club, who suddenly attacked Arcis, and didn't say anything. Paul narrowed his eyes and looked at Li Tianlan. Suddenly, he smiled playfully. "Now, we can have a good time." Chapter 5:17. No one could have imagined that the situation would suddenly become like this. Li Tianlan couldn't have imagined it. Arcis couldn't have imagined it. Paul couldn't have imagined it either. Everyone thought that the war would last for a long time. But in an instant, the red light burst out, and the dim yellow light lit up. The whole night sky suddenly became quiet. This war, which was bound to shock the whole dark world, suddenly came to an end. The general trend had been decided. The outcome had been decided. President Charlemagne of the Heroes Club. He ranked 6th on the World Divine list. He held the murderous weapon Twilight of the Gods. His participation instantly reversed all the situations. Even the battles between the elites of the major forces had stopped. The elites of the Heroes Club looked at their president, a little confused, a little embarrassed, and more at a loss. The dim yellow light in the sky gradually dimmed and melted in the seemingly endless rain. Dusk passed. The night was still night. Charlemagne stood not far from Paul. The eyes of this president, who was also very close to the peak of the invincible realm, were calm and cold. Li Tianlan suddenly nodded, as if he understood something, or as if he understood. The Heroes Club was supposed to be his ally tonight. Everyone knew this. The new invincible realm expert of the Heroes Club also expressed his position with his death. But not all allies were as reliable as the Dark Knights. Raphael would rather be seriously injured or even die to put the Dark Saint spear on Li Tianlan to protect him from harm. Because he was one of them. But the Heroes Club was just an ally. They cooperated for the sake of interests. Now Situ Tsangyue was seriously injured, Raphael was seriously injured, Tribulation was seriously injured, and Qin Shilai was seriously injured. The people around him were either dead or injured, while King Tong, Lagos, and Hustile were standing next to Paul, as well as the devil army with unimaginable destructive power. Li Tianlan would lose. Whether this was true or not, at least this was Charlemagne's judgment. So when the battle was in a stalemate, when the devil troop knocked Li Tianlan into the battlefield and was about to self-destruct, Charlemagne directly took action. He took action against Arsis. The murderous weapon Twilight of the Gods roared over Eastern Europe. The explosion of the devil troop and the murderous weapon sounded at the same time. The huge power was superimposed for a moment. The aftermath of the explosion of the devil and the energy of the Twilight of the Gods all hit Arsis. Even an expert at the peak of the invincible realm could not resist the murderous weapon without preparation. As a result, Arsis was also heavily injured. The aftermath of the huge power swept across the battlefield and even disabled Raphael and Situ Tsangyue. Only Li Tianlan was not seriously injured under the protection of the Dark Saint spear. Charlemagne made the calmest and most rational choice. For the sake of the benefits at hand, he gave up the hatred and resentment of Mitchell's murder and stood by the winner. It was hard to understand. But it was also extremely normal. No one despised what Charlemagne had done. His actions couldn't even be considered as betrayal. This was the dark world. The relationship between friend and foe had always been extremely vague. "What do you want?" Paul looked at Charlemagne and suddenly asked. His entire body was completely relaxed. The battle with Arsis had injured him. The injury was not light, but it was not serious either. At least, it did not affect his combat power. Right now, he was still the strongest person present. This kind of strength could allow him to solve everything. That included getting rid of Mellad and Li Tianlan, and completely establishing the general trend of Wulan state. Li Tianlan was alone. The huge advantage he had before had completely disappeared. There was no chance for him to make a comeback. He was a loser. And there were 3 invincible realm experts assisting him. He could also turn Charlemagne into a loser. Paul narrowed his eyes and looked at Charlemagne thoughtfully. Charlemagne opened his hand slightly. A fist-sized stone was left where the devil had exploded. The stone flew into his hand, emitting a faint red light. Paul's face changed and he remained silent. "Europe is yours." Charlemagne looked down at the stone in his hand and said flatly, "America belongs to the Heroes Club." Everyone was staring at the stone in Charlemagne's hand. Everyone knew what it was. This was a murderous weapon belonging to Star State. The holy punishment of Void. The devil detonated the holy punishment of Void and killed Kasrotter. The remaining materials of the murderous weapon were absorbed into the devil's body and finally exploded in the field. The holy punishment of Void was extremely damaged. It could be predicted that it would be difficult for this murderous weapon to recover its peak power in the long years. But this stone was the core of the holy punishment of void. If possible, who wouldn't want to take it for themselves? What do you think? Charlemagne glanced at Paul. Intentionally or unintentionally, he waved the murderous weapon in his hand. The body of the twilight of the gods was slender and ferocious. The muzzle was rough, and the whole body was dark yellow, with a kind of breathtaking magic. Paul looked at the twilight of the gods and was silent for a long time. The 12 murderous weapons in the dark world might become the 11 murderous weapons tonight. Among the 11 murderous weapons, the twilight of the gods had a domineering name, but its power was the worst. But it was also the most valued murderous weapon. Because the twilight of the gods sacrificed its overall power, it had a feature that other murderous weapons didn't have. It could shoot continuously. The human emperor who could destroy the world with one shot. The indefinite grace with the strongest single penetrating power. The blue sky underworld with violent power. The sunset with the fastest energy accumulation. The murderous weapon often had the power to change the overall situation with one shot. So almost all murderous weapons only needed one shot. But the twilight of the gods had a completely different idea. The twilight of the gods could store energy once, but it could shoot continuously. No one knew how many shots the twilight of the gods could shoot continuously, which was also a big suspense in the dark world. Since the establishment of the Heroes Club, the twilight of the gods had fired 3 times in one day and killed 3 invincible realm experts. Its power was indeed the weakest among the murderous weapons, but it had the highest error tolerance. No matter how weak a murderous weapon was, it was still a murderous weapon. Ordinary invincible realm experts naturally couldn't withstand it. Today, it was the first time the twilight of the gods had fired in recent years. Only one shot. With the explosion of the devil troop and Paul's attack, Arcis was seriously injured. And the next second. As long as Charlemagne wanted, the muzzle of the twilight of the gods could be aimed at Paul and fired again. Paul nodded and said calmly, "That's good. Happy cooperation." Charlemagne put away the core of the holy punishment of void with no expression on his face. No one said anything. Since there was cooperation, Rothschild had to give compensation. The Heroes Club lost an invincible realm expert. Now Charlemagne took the core of the holy punishment of void, and the loss was even. This core was destined not to become the holy punishment of void again. It was likely to be used to strengthen the twilight of the gods. Whether it was strengthening the number of shots of the twilight of the gods or strengthening its power, it was not a good thing for the dark world. It also meant the birth of another peerless murderous weapon that could even rival the human emperor and the indefinite grace. Paul took a deep look at Charlemagne. After tonight, the pattern of the dark world would change greatly. The men in black and the dragons in the fantasy world would be leaderless. The murderous weapon of Star State would have a new owner. The Jiang family of South America would also lose Jiang Qinyan, and Jiang Qiansong would be expelled from the Jiang family of South America. All of America, whether it was South America or North America, would be the world of the Heroes Club. Just like today's Europe, whether it was Eastern Europe or Western Europe, after tonight, it would be the world of Rothschild and the Eastern Church. Paul suddenly reached out and patted Charlemagne on the shoulder. He said calmly, "As long as you kill Arcis, the cooperation will take effect immediately." Arcis had fallen far away, unconscious and silent. Charlemagne raised his eyebrows sharply. Boom! The surrounding space was instantly distorted. Under the night sky, a magnificent sword light suddenly flashed. The sword light was extremely dazzling. It divided heaven and earth, but it also pulled heaven and earth. In an instant, it seemed that the whole starry sky had fallen under this sword. Under the sword light, the sword energy was surging and vast like an ocean. Endless sword energy surged toward Paul. Several invincible realm experts subconsciously took a few steps back. The surging sword light was like a sea. The battlefield was misty. The sword light went from one end to the other at a rapid speed and disappeared in an instant. Several Invincible Realm experts looked at each other in surprise and did not speak. Paul looked ahead, and his face was a little livid. In his sight, Arsis, who was unconscious on the ground, had disappeared. At the same time, Mellad disappeared. It doesn't matter. After a long time, Paul said slowly, in a short time, Arsis won't recover from his injury. No one can stop us. Just now, King Tong hesitated. Was it Mellad? Paul nodded. On the battlefield of the Invincible Realm, he had already noticed that Mellad had hidden his strength. His real strength was even stronger than King Tong's current strength. He should be on par with Charlemagne. Charlemagne, on the other hand, ranked 6th on the divine list. Such strength was really very close to the peak of the Invincible Realm. But Paul did not expect that the second commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps of the Vatican used a sword. The majestic and magnificent sword light blew away the silence. The whole battlefield suddenly broke out again. The elites of the Vatican were still there because of the escape of the second commander. Charlemagne had already raised his palm. The hero would obey all orders. In an instant, the Dark Knights, who had just been fighting side by side with the Vatican, directly aimed their blades at the Vatican. The Saint warriors fell down in large numbers. In the great chaos, the army of Wulan State slowly pressed over. Situ Tsangyue and Raphael were carried back to the office of the president in the chaos. Paul saw this scene, but he did not stop it. He could judge the state of Raphael and Situ Tsangyue. Situ Tsangyue was in a slightly better state, but her strength was weak. Raphael was seriously injured, but he was strong. Neither of them was in a good state. At least, it was impossible for them to recover without a few years of rest. After tonight, Eastern Europe would be his. Of course, he would not give the two of them time to recuperate. What could they do even if they retreated to the office of the president? Paul took a step forward and looked at Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan stood in his original position. The Dark Saint spear turned into an extremely close-fitting armor and stuck to his body. His face was indifferent, without sadness or joy. You didn't run away. Paul laughed. Tonight, the Shadow Throne was disbanded, and he was forced to take action. Rothschild could be said to have suffered a heavy loss. But now, he was the winner after all. All the losses would be made up with this victory. So he had no reason not to be in a good mood. Where to? Li Tianlan asked. His tone was quiet and dead silent. Paul was stunned for a moment and then understood what he meant. Where could Li Tianlan go now? The sword light just now was a chance for him to escape, but what would happen after that? Should he go back to the office of the president and gather the Snowdance Corps to fight them to the death? There were still nearly 10,000 elites in the Snowdance Corps. They were the most elite corps in the world. But Paul, King Tong, Lagos, Hastile, and Charlemagne. An expert who was infinitely close to the peak of the Invincible Realm. 2 experts who were close to the peak of the Invincible Realm. 2 on the divine list. There were also the elites of the Heroes Club, Rothschild, the Eastern Church, the Morton family, and the Violet family. The Snowdance Corps couldn't resist this force. Where could he go if he left the Snowdance Corps? Escape back to Zhongzhou State? He was the Marshal of Zhongzhou State. On the first day he came to Zhongzhou State, he set off the date of death and then planned the trial day tonight. Now the Snowdance Corps had suffered heavy losses. Zhongzhou State had suffered heavy losses. He also imprisoned the Sword Emperor. In the end, he ended up with a crushing defeat. What would be the consequences of returning to Zhongzhou State? He couldn't bear the crime of imprisoning the Sword Emperor. He also couldn't bear the crime of almost wiping out the Snowdance Corps. Rothschild would not let him go in Eastern Europe. In Zhongzhou State, Kunlun City, the Wang family of Beihai, and the Prince Group would not let him go either. Li Tianlan had no way out. He wanted to stand here. He could only stand here. He could only stand here. Even if he died in battle. If he died in battle here, he would still be guilty and would be nailed to death on the pillar of shame. But at least it was not treason. After his death, the Li family could still barely survive. Maybe they would return from Lin and to the primeval forest where they couldn't drink clean water or eat meat. They would also go to a worse place. But the Li family was still there. Paul looked at Li Tianlan quietly. Li Tianlan's expression was calm. There was no tragedy, no unwillingness, no madness. Only calmness. Whether it was helplessness, grief, or resentment. In this situation, everything was meaningless. The few remaining members of the devil troop in the field were eyeing him covetously. Li Tianlan looked up at the night sky. The night sky in Eastern Europe was cold and lonely, high and distant. After all, he still didn't bear the future and hope of the Li family. He was the chosen one with amazing talent, but he could do nothing now. The falling stars turned into a long sword on his wrist. Li Tianlan held the sword with both hands, looked at Paul, and said calmly, "Come on." The only thing he could do now was to draw the sword. "Do you have any last words?" Paul looked at him with some emotion in his eyes. At this moment, Li Tianlan was like a microcosm of an era in his eyes. Hundreds of years ago, the Li family was like the rising sun, shining brightly. The original invincible realm expert of the Li family joined forces with the Wang family of Beihai to suppress the Vatican and help Rothschild get through the difficulties. 20 years ago, the Li family was like the sun in the sky. Its light was so bright that people couldn't look at it directly. In the last 2 decades, it was the Li family's twilight. The light was still there, but it was gradually dimming. The only hope had been stumbling forward in the general trend, but the road ahead was not clear. And now, the hope of the Li family was about to die. This family, which had been glorious in Zhongzhou state for hundreds of years, was about to enter the everlasting night. The funniest thing was that it was Rothschild, who helped the Li family when it first rose, that completely plunged the Li family into darkness. Paul was in a trance, but there was no guilt in his eyes. Li Tianlan didn't speak. But the blade of the falling stars suddenly gave off a dazzling sword light. It was not his swordsmanship. It was the 24 moves of sword. The purest 24 moves of sword. It was as if he was bearing something, but also as if he was venting something. After many years, the light of the 24 moves of sword once again lit up under the sky of Eastern Europe and rushed to the sky. The first blade, Wuji. The condensed and sharp sword light lit up on the blade. The blade of the falling stars stabbed straight at Paul. It was shining, dazzling, persistent, and crazy. Paul raised his palm. He was an expert who was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm. In the face of Li Tianlan, he didn't even need to use weapons. A shadow bloomed in his hand. The bright sword blade instantly pierced into the shadow. Bang! Paul raised his palm. Li Tianlan was directly sent flying by him with one hand and hit a wall dozens of meters away. The wall collapsed with a crash. Smoke and dust were flying. The sword light lit up. The fifth blade, flying snow. A large amount of sword intent brought out icicles and kept whistling. King Tong appeared in front of Li Tianlan. You should have seen this day coming. Her eyes were cruel and happy. The chosen one? In my eyes, you are a clown. You have always been. Ridiculous and stupid. Bang! The Shadow Kingdom stretched out around King Tong. The incomparably condensed domain wiped out the sword intent and pulled Li Tianlan's body in front of King Tong. King Tong stretched out her long legs and kicked Li Tianlan's face directly. Li Tianlan's body was smashed back like a cannonball. Blood fell to the ground with the rain. Li Tianlan's body moved in the mess. The raging fire was flying in the rain. The eighth blade, burning sky. Heresy should be judged by God. The light of heaven in Hastiel's hand was extremely bright. The surging light completely penetrated Li Tianlan's body in an instant. The raging fire went out. Blood burst out of Li Tianlan's body. The falling stars flew out of his hand and into the distance, turning into a stream of silver light. A mess of stones and dust had almost completely drowned Li Tianlan. He had the combat capability of the invincible realm in the dark world. But the gap between him and the real invincible realm on the divine list was completely revealed at this moment. Blood was flowing all over his body, and he staggered to his feet. I will die. His voice was quiet and terrifying, but there were countless emotions hidden in his eyes. But Violet, Morton, and the other 3 patriarchs of the Eastern Church will all die with me tonight. Boom! The huge shadow of the fist came down from the sky. Li Tianlan's figure was directly smashed to the ground by the punch without any room to resist. Lagos's stiff and furious voice sounded. Say that again? Li Tianlan suddenly laughed. The next moment, the figure of Lagos, the patriarch of the Morton family, appeared directly in front of Li Tianlan. The fist with infinite power fell on Li Tianlan like a storm. Say it. Say it again. Bang, bang, bang. Blood kept splashing. Paul and King Tong stood together. Charlemagne stood aside. Hastile frowned. Everyone was looking at Li Tianlan, whose blood was splashing, with indifferent eyes. Bang! Lagos's punch directly sent Li Tianlan's body flying, and his figure appeared directly above Li Tianlan. He stepped directly on him. The extremely terrifying foot stepped directly on Li Tianlan's face. Li Tianlan's head was stepped into the ground. Say it? Aren't you very talkative? Lagos's laughter was crazy and twisted. Li Tianlan's body was still moving. He couldn't get up, but he could still crawl forward with his hands. He stretched out his hands. The next moment, they fell on a pair of feet. The feet stood firmly on the ground, motionless. Li Tianlan's body suddenly trembled. Apex. Chapter 5:18. It was night in Linnan. The lake was rippling, and the night wind was cool. Under a luxuriant willow by the lake, Li Honghe put a piece of spiced beef into his mouth, drank up the wine in the glass, and said, "It tastes good. Don't you want to try it?" The wine was huadiao, brewed by Yu Donglai himself. It was mellow and delicious. Even though the night wind was getting stronger, the fragrance of the wine was still wafting. Dongxing Hongguang stared at Li Honghe motionlessly. He didn't touch the food or drink, nor did he speak. You said you believed me. Li Honghe looked more serious. He looked at Dongxing Hongguang with deep eyes. I believe you. Dongxing Hongguang nodded. But I didn't come here from Zhongyuan to listen to this. Then what do you want to hear? Li Honghe asked. His tone was calm, tasteless, and even desireless. Something else. Dongxing Hongguang said indifferently. The old man who used to be in charge of the army headquarters of Zhongzhou State was introverted at this moment, but his eyes flashed with an extremely sharp and heavy edge. Something else? Li Honghe asked. Something else. Dongxing Hongguang repeated it again. Li Honghe fell silent. The night wind blew the willow, and the treetops rustled. The leaves fell on the surface of the West Lake, causing ripples and spreading softly. The wind was getting colder. It was about to rain in Linnan. Li Honghe was silent for a long time before he slowly said, I can't say. He and Dongxing Hongguang were old friends. They had known each other for decades and were very close friends. But now the old friend wanted to hear something else. But he couldn't say it. The phone suddenly rang. Dongxing Hongguang took the phone. Someone on the phone reported something in a hurried tone. Dongxing Hongguang's face remained unchanged, but he suddenly clenched his fists in his sleeves for a moment. A deep blue thunderbolt was reflected in Li Honghe's pupils. There was a muffled thunder in the air, rolling across the sky. Dongxing Hongguang put down the phone in his hand and slowly sat in front of Li Honghe. Li Honghe wanted to take the wine in front of him, but under such a gaze, he withdrew his hand calmly. The two looked at each other for a long time. Dongxing Hongguang raised the phone in his hand and said expressionlessly, I just got the news. Hidden god Situt Sanyue withdrew from the battlefield with heavy injuries. The leader of the Dark Knights, Raphael, was seriously injured and left the battlefield. Melad of the Vatican ran away with Arcis. Bang! He slammed the phone on the table and leaned over to look at Li Honghe. Now in Reki City, there is only Tianlan himself. Li Honghe was silent for a while and shook his head. I'm fine. Crash! Dongxing Hongguang suddenly stood up and overturned the table full of wine and dishes in front of him. The meat and cold dishes were thrown up, the wine jars were overturned in the air, and the table was broken. All of them fell into the West Lake, fluttering. He's fine. Dongxing Hongguang's thunder-like roar suddenly sounded. What will happen? Huh? Do you have to wait until all the Invincible Realm experts stand in front of Li Tianlan before you say anything? Am I right? Tianlan is not only your grandson, but also my grandson. Now that child has to face Paul, King Tong, the Heroes Club, the Eastern Church, and the Morton family. He was only 22 years old. He's only 22. Li Honghe quietly looked at Dongxing Hongguang, who was a little hysterical. Not far away, the guards of the Dongxing clan and the elites of the Li family ran over at the same time. Li Honghe waved his hand. Everyone retreated again. There was a light rain falling from the sky. The wind gradually died down. The rain was getting heavier. In the gradually rapid sound of the rain, Li Honghe looked at Dongxing Hongguang and said slowly, "This is the weight he should bear." Yes. Dongxing Hongguang took a deep breath. He has something to bear. But we old guys are still alive. You're still alive. He's working hard in Eastern Europe now. What are you doing? Drinking a little wine and happily saying that it's all right? What's your plan? Tell me. His voice became a little pleading. Even his eyes were pleading. Even a little. Li Honghe looked at him. From Dongxing Hongguang's eyes, he saw worry, anxiety, and more fear. It was an extremely real fear. This old man came to Lin and from Zhongyuan, and all he wanted was a little psychological comfort. But Li Honghe couldn't give him that. He shook his head. I can't say. Dongxing Hongguang looked at him, and the light in his eyes gradually disappeared. I regret it, he said suddenly. Li Honghe was stunned, then shook his head. He still said the same two words, monotonous and calm. It's all right. I know Situt Sanyue is your person. Dongxing Hongguang paused and said with a self-deprecating smile, I'm afraid that even Li Guangtu didn't know that he knew Situt Sanyue. It was all your arrangement. It was also you who arranged for her to go to Mount Taibai through Great Master Wu Wei. She could enter the Invincible Realm because of your guidance. Dongxing Hongguang looked at Li Honghe. She is a chess piece in your hand, but this chess piece has now withdrawn from the battlefield. What other chess pieces do you have? No matter how many chess pieces there are, it's useless. Li Honghe said calmly, what's the point of having more chess pieces on the chessboard? It may be meaningful, but it's not the most important thing. Then what's the most important thing? Dongxing Hongguang looked into Li Honghe's eyes and asked. The most important thing, of course, is the hand that plays chess. Without this hand, the chess pieces can't move on the chessboard, or they will only walk around randomly and get worse and worse. With that hand here, even if the chess pieces are gone, the palm can directly overturn the whole chessboard. Li Honghe said. Well said. Dongxing Hongguang was silent for a while, then nodded and said, it's easy for you to say. In Reki City, Paul was infinitely close to the peak of the Invincible Realm. Charlemagne's strength was not as good as Paul's, but it was higher than King Tong's. His strength was similar to Paul's. Moreover, the twilight of the gods could be launched continuously. With the murderous weapon in hand, his combat capability might not be lower than Paul's. These were two experts who were infinitely close to the peak of the Invincible Realm. There was also King Tong who was close to the peak of the Invincible Realm. There were also two people on the divine list. And people suspected to be from the devil troop. Could such a chessboard be overturned with one hand? What kind of hand would that be? Now you're saying that Wang Tianzong has always been your person, and I'm willing to believe it. Dongqing Hongguang said seriously. What he said was absurd, but his tone was very solemn. Of course not. Li Honghe shook his head and said, Reki City tonight, after all, is the Li family's own business. A bolt of thunder flashed across the sky. Under the wind and rain, the old man looked into the distance and repeated calmly, "It's okay." The vehicle was running in the messy streets of Reki City. In the huge carriage, Lin Fengting looked at the picture on the screen in silence. There was no fluke. No matter how heaven-defying Li Tianlan was, it was impossible for him to turn defeat into victory under the attack of several invincible realm experts. The wind and rain were messy. Li Tianlan's body was like a ball, being hit from one side to the other by several invincible realm experts. Cruel, ruthless, vicious, and insidious. This was the most blatant torture and killing. This was the cruelest way to vent. But Li Tianlan was still attacking. Time and time again. His body flew out, and the long sword fell out of his hand. But he struggled to stand up again and again. Without a sword, he punched. His attack was terrible, but it was futile. There were still 5 invincible realm experts in front of Li Tianlan. But even the weakest Lagos was an expert on the divine list, far better than Li Tianlan. His counterattack was directly suppressed by several invincible realm experts. The great power destroyed his body, even the foundation and vitality in his body. Li Tianlan stood up, fell down, and then stood up again. He had no way back. Even if he died here, he could not retreat. Lin Fengting watched silently and did not speak for a long time. Bang! There was the sound of a heavy object falling to the ground behind him. Lin Fengting looked back. In his sight, Situ Yue, who was in a white dress and covered in blood, fell from her seat. She clenched her hands and struggled to stand up. But her injury was too serious to stand up. In the end, she chose to kneel on the ground. She knelt in front of Lin Fengting. The hidden god of Zhongzhou State, who had been extremely proud all her life, tried to kneel there, with blood flowing and tears streaming down her face. Please, she looked at the picture on the screen. In the picture, the rain of blood was flying. Li Tianlan's figure was swaying. Situ Yue's eyes fell on Lin Fengting. That was the weakness and pleading after giving up all dignity and honor. She was weak but very real. Please, save her, please. Her body was trembling, and her head was getting lower and lower. Lin Fengting took a step forward and also knelt in front of Situ Yue. His eyes were calm, but there was an undisguised bitter smile on his face. Your Highness, you're too serious. I can't afford such a big bow. Get up first. Get up first. Situ Yue grabbed Lin Fengting's wrist with all her strength. She shook her head and repeated, Please, save him. I can't do it tonight. Lin Fengting's voice was apologetic. But I can assure you that Tianlan will be fine. Situ Yue looked at Lin Fengting in a daze. Her eyes were black and white, and finally, they completely turned into hatred. You have the ability to save him. Why not? Why? Why? At this moment, Situ Yue hated Lin Fengting very much. It was unreasonable, and she didn't want to be reasonable. She hated all those who had the ability to help Li Tianlan but stood by. Governor, you've done enough tonight. Next, you should have a good rest. But Tianlan hasn't done anything yet. Lin Fengting said softly. He's still a child. Situ Yue said word by word. Her voice was hoarse, and blood flowed from the corner of her mouth. She stared into Lin Fengting's eyes. What can he do now? He can't kill anyone. Lin Fengting was silent for a while and said slowly, but at least he cannot retreat. In front of him were 5 invincible realm experts, monstrous waves, infinite mountains, violent storms, lightning flashes, and thunder. But Li Tianlan could not retreat. Because behind him was the real abyss, silent as the eternal night. Tonight's matter is not something we can intervene in. Lin Fengting patted Situ Cangyue's palm and said calmly, "This is the Li family's own business." He would not make a move. Because he had promised Qin Weibai that he would hide a sword. A sword at the peak. The Snowdance Corps was also watching the scene on the battlefield. In the scene, Li Tianlan was sent flying again and again. He was covered in blood, but he still moved forward. It had nothing to do with reason, nor was it about cleverness or stupidity. Standing in this position, even if he were to die, he could only move forward. More and more elites of the Snowdance Corps saw this scene. The scene finally appeared on the square in front of the office of the president. The wind and rain were endless. There was silence under the wind and rain. Everyone in the Snowdance Corps was watching this scene. Their bodies gradually tightened. Everyone stared at the figure of Li Tianlan being sent flying again and again on the screen. The summer rain in Eastern Europe was as cold as ice. But a violent atmosphere rose in silence, rising when Li Tianlan was sent flying again and again. The entire office of the president seemed to have become a real volcano. There was a kind of strong and crazy fighting intent and humiliation everywhere. Lightning cut through the sky. Thunder suddenly rose. A clear and sharp sword light suddenly flashed behind the office of the president. The sword light went all the way north. The north was the battlefield. Everyone subconsciously glanced at the sword light. The sword light was so clear and so quiet. That was the sword of Jade Pool. The entire Snowdance Corps seemed to be completely ignited by this sword light in an instant. There were no high-level officials in the Snowdance Corps. But countless roars rang out at the same time. The roar, like that of a demon, shook heaven and earth and resounded throughout the city. Kill them. Kill them. There was no hesitation or even mobilization. Under the wind and rain, there were many twisted faces that were enraged to the extreme. The footsteps rumbled. It was like thunder. All the soldiers of the Snowdance Corps picked up their weapons at this moment and followed the sword light to the north without hesitation. On the battlefield north of the office of the president, the marshal they had sworn to follow was being humiliated. Zhongzhou State. They were being humiliated. The defense of the office of the president was no longer important. It didn't matter whether they could kill a few invincible realm experts or not. Even if they died, they were going to die on the battlefield in the north. They were impassioned. Without the leadership of the high-level officials, the Snowdance Corps was like a torrent that could destroy everything, rushing forward under the wind, rain, and light. In the office of the president, Wang Tianzong stood in front of his window and looked at the outside world. He was silent for a long time. There was no Snowdance Corps here, and he was no longer confined. But he never left. In the chaotic footsteps, the last few soldiers of the Snowdance Corps rushed over. They suddenly stopped and looked at Wang Tianzong. Wang Tianzong also looked at them with an indifferent expression. The faces of several soldiers of the Snowdance Corps were also cold. They were all the most ordinary soldiers. The one with the highest military rank was nearly 40 years old, but he was only a captain. His martial cultivation had just reached the ice-condensing realm. In the face of the invincible realm experts, the Snowdance Corps, who respected the strong, used to show full respect. In the face of the invincible Sword Emperor, even if they were enemies, the Snowdance Corps still did not neglect him. But at this moment, the eyes of this small team of soldiers of the Snowdance Corps were completely full of indifference and contempt when they looked at Wang Tianzong. Your Majesty, Sword Emperor. The captain in the lead suddenly stretched out his hand and pointed to the north. Just more than 10 kilometers away, Marshal Li is facing 5 invincible realm experts in the Dark World alone. He won't be their match. But he won't retreat. The Snowdance Corps won't be their match either, but we won't retreat either. Because each of us knows that once we retreat tonight, it means that Zhongzhou State has given up Wulan State in Eastern Europe, which means that we have given up too many national interests. If Marshal Li doesn't retreat, we won't retreat either. He looked at Wang Tianzong and roared, "What about you? I heard that His Majesty's sword energy can move 10,000 meters high. When countless people in Zhongzhou State are fighting for the interests of Zhongzhou State, what the hell are you doing as the sword emperor of Zhongzhou State?" Wang Tianzong narrowed his eyes and looked at the most ordinary officer in the Snowdance Corps, who was at the basic level, without saying a word. The captain looked at Wang Tianzong for a while and suddenly sneered. "Bah!" He spat at Wang Tianzong's window. The captain turned around and left. Damn the sword emperor of Zhongzhou State. Chapter 519. It was also raining in Yuzhou. The heavy rain was majestic, and it was more chaotic than that of Lin'an and Reki City. The heavy rain suddenly arrived at night, roaring through the entire city, swift and violent. In the hidden Dragon Sea, President Li Huaqing of Zhongzhou State was still standing in his study, watching the real-time broadcast from Reki City in silence. Xia Ji sat on the sofa in the study and drank tea. She looked calm and relaxed, with a faint smile on her lips. Dongqing Wudi sat upright. His gaze was fixed on the screen, his eyes cold and deep. Heavy rain fell from the window, and the rain beat on the window lattice. The study room was lit, and it was quiet. There was only the dazzling light and shadow caused by the flickering of the silent screen. Dongqing Wudi looked at the battlefield on the screen motionlessly, looking more and more focused. Everything was clear. It was so clear that the situation in Reki City was completely clear at a glance. They occupied Reki City at lightning speed and deterred the 5 Eastern European countries centered on Reki City. The Qin clan advanced and retreated together, and Rekvia surrendered. The Snowdance Corps had an obvious advantage in Reki City in the early stage. Tens of thousands of troops, several invincible realm experts, and many allies. Such a Snowdance Corps was powerful. No one would think that Li Tianlan should not consolidate his advantage. He could even turn his advantage into victory. Therefore, the Snowdance Corps reported to Kunlun City in writing. The Snowdance Corps was a special warfare battalion. When there was a major decision, it naturally had to report to Kunlun City. However, the commander of the Snowdance Corps was Li Tianlan, so such a report was only a situation after all. Gu Xingyan was very tactful and expressed his support in principle. He would not object. It would be useless even if he did. So the Snowdance Corps reported to the military headquarters again. After receiving the report of the Snowdance Corps, Dongqing Wudi secretly discussed with President Li Huaqing of Zhongzhou State for more than 2 hours and finally agreed to the action plan of the Snowdance Corps. This plan was not conveyed to the outside world, not even the most basic procedure to be conveyed to the bigwigs at the councillor level of the Zhongzhou Decision-Making Committee. Therefore, there was no high-level meeting. Only Li Huaqing and Dongqing Wudi knew the plan. So Wang Tianzong would leave the Caesar Hotel and eventually be imprisoned in the office of the president. Then the plan officially began. This plan seemed to be aimed at the Shadow Throne and Rothschild. In fact, this was indeed the case. But this was also a facade. Rothschild was only the primary target of the Snowdance Corps. Because of the intelligence of Samsara Palace, the real target of the Snowdance Corps was Rothschild's ally. For example, the Violet family. For example, the Morton family. For example, the Eastern Church. In a sense, the chaos in Eastern Europe was the internal strife of the 4 families. Now 2 of the 4 families had united around the Snowdance Corps. If the other 2 families were eliminated, the whole of Eastern Europe would slowly enter the circle of Zhongzhou State under the strong influence of Zhongzhou State. Li Tianlan's plan was insane. But it was also beautiful. Both Li Huaqing and Dongqing Wudi could clearly see the feasibility of this plan. Because the Snowdance Corps had enough strength and advantages. The whole plan went surprisingly smoothly at first. The Shadow Throne was completely disbanded. After the symbolic victory, accidents happened one after another. Paul, who was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm, became the most fatal loophole in the plan. In the War of the Dark World, the number of people was naturally crucial. But sometimes, it was the strong, or only the strong, who could really affect the overall situation. Paul's powerful strength was the first surprise. The delay of Arisus's entry into the battlefield was the second surprise. In the general trend of the Dark World, only the real strong could affect the overall situation. If Arsus didn't come, it would be difficult for Paul to balance. The betrayal of the holy punishment of Void and Cass Rotter's betrayal were the third surprise. None of this was too fatal. The most fatal thing was the participation of President Charlemagne of the Heroes Club and the Twilight of the Gods. They were originally allies of the Snowdance Corps, but now they were on Rothschild's side. So in an instant, all the advantages of Li Tianlan and the Snowdance Corps completely collapsed, and there was nothing left. Li Huaqing looked at the situation on the battlefield. At the same time, he was also looking at the restlessness of the Snowdance Corps in the office of the president. His face gradually became embarrassed. Li Tianlan now had to face 5 Invincible Realm experts alone. And the worst one was in the Invincible Realm on the Divine list. In addition, there were also elites and experts of several major forces. He couldn't see any possibility of Li Tianlan making a comeback. None at all. After tonight, Li Tianlan was bound to die. A 22-year-old expert with the combat capability of the Invincible Realm died. This was equivalent to Zhongzhou State giving up the absolute dominance in the Dark World in the future 10 or 20 years in advance. Was such a loss a heavy one? After tonight's battle, the Snowdance Corps would also not survive. Tens of thousands of the most elite warriors of Zhongzhou State would be buried in Reki City. This was the combat capability equivalent to at least 100,000 elite troops. Was such a loss a heavy one? After tonight's battle, Reki City, which had originally been obtained, would completely fall into the hands of Rothschild. Prime Minister Rieker would not be spared. Rekvia and the Qin clan, which had just entered the camp of Zhongzhou State, would also be completely destroyed. The forces of Zhongzhou State would withdraw from Reki City, and then even the Arctic Ocean Command of Zhongzhou State would be affected. The more than 100,000 troops were very likely to withdraw from Eastern Europe in compromises. Zhongzhou State's hard work for more than 20 years would be destroyed in a day. Was such a loss a heavy one? After tonight's battle, Zhongzhou State was about to face the most tragic failure in the Dark World in recent decades or even in recent centuries. And all this could have been avoided. No, even now, it could be avoided. Li Huaqing's face was a little livid. He couldn't help glancing at Summer Solstice. Summer Solstice seemed to feel Li Huaqing's emotions. She smiled gently, gentle and dignified, and whispered, "Don't worry, Mr. President. I can represent the Wang family of Beihai. Zhongzhou guarantees that after tonight, Reki City will still belong to Zhongzhou State, and Eastern Europe will also belong to Zhongzhou State." Dongxing Wudi's eyes suddenly flashed with an amazing evil spirit. Summer Solstice's guarantee was very powerful. This was something that they could all see. Because Wang Tianzong was still in Reki City and had not taken action. Wang Tianzong did not take action before because he was too strong. The Wang family of Beihai was too strong. Once he took the initiative to take action, everyone would target him and the Wang family of Beihai. But now it was different. Paul was originally their ally. Even if, at the very least, Rothschild would be blinded by the immediate interests, what did Wang Tianzong have to fear? Li Tianlan was now facing 5 Invincible Realm experts. But if it was Wang Tianzong, he was only facing 5 Invincible Realm experts. This was the gap between Wang Tianzong and Li Tianlan. This sentence was equivalent to saying that as long as Li Tianlan died, Wang Tianzong would take action. It was blatant, without any disguise. This was the final moment. There was no need for any disguise. Everyone knew what each other was thinking. So what if they said it out? Li Huaqing's face was still a little ugly. Dongxing Wudi's cell phone suddenly vibrated. Summer Solstice's eyes moved. There was a text message on Dongxing Wudi's cell phone. It was a blank text message without any content. But the sender only had one word. Shallow. Dongxing Wudi looked at the cell phone, deleted the blank text message, and finally sent another text message. The text message was sent out quickly, and no one knew where it went. He put the cell phone back in place, very gently. For some reason, Summer Solstice suddenly felt that this very light hand carried unparalleled power. It was a kind of sharpness that could destroy everything. The room was quiet for a long time. For a long time, no one spoke. The light and shadow on the screen kept changing. Paul was the first to move. Then all the attacks fell on Li Tianlan. Blood dripped. It rained heavily. Li Tianlan stood up again and was crushed by the huge force. Falling stars turned into silver light and flew out of his hand. Legos stamped Li Tianlan's head into the ground with one foot. Dongxing Wudi watched silently, and his whole person seemed extremely quiet. A phone suddenly rang. It was the red encrypted phone in the study. Summer Solstice's heart jumped for no reason. She subconsciously glanced at Dongxing Wudi. Li Huaqing walked to the phone and answered the call. The other party reported something in a hurry on the phone, and his voice was so high that it was almost distorted. Summer Solstice's phone also rang. It was a text message. She looked down and glanced at it, and her gentle and moving face changed dramatically in an instant. Only Dongxing Wudi sat quietly and kept his composure. Li Huaqing took a deep look at Dongxing Wudi. There was thinking and hesitation in his eyes, and finally all the emotions disappeared in his eyes. He put down the phone and slowly sat on the desk behind the desk without saying a word. He no longer looked at the screen, nor did he look at Dongxing Wudi. He just looked out of the window quietly. It was raining and windy. Lightning flashed and thunder rumbled. The capital was brightly lit under the heavy rain, but the atmosphere of the whole city suddenly became gloomy, chaotic, oppressive, and dark. A dark shadow appeared silently on the wide street. A large number of shadows set out from different places. They appeared on countless roads in Yuzhou City and slowly moved forward. The atmosphere of Yuzhou City, which was still cheerful in the heavy rain, seemed to be completely frozen. In a luxury restaurant, several guests were about to leave after eating and drinking, but their steps seemed to be pulled by someone when they went out of the door. A few seconds later, they returned to the restaurant at the same time. The traffic in the entire Yuzhou City was controlled. The green and red lights kept flashing. The traffic on the streets and alleys passed by in the fastest time. The street was empty. And the emptiness was occupied by the shadows in an instant. The road was roaring. The heavy rain fell, and the thunder roared above the ninth heaven. The dark shadow moved slowly in the heavy rain. The sound of rotors sounded in the air. The sound of rotors echoed in countless corners of the air. One after another, armed helicopters hovered in the heavy rain. There seemed to be a strange roar falling from the sky at a higher altitude. On the ground, the latest main battle tank rolled across the flat street in silence and incomparably domineering manner. Military trucks loaded with heavily armed troops came one after another. Countless. It was silent. Boundless. Tanks, armored vehicles, and infantry fighting vehicles roared past. The atmosphere of the entire Yuzhou City became completely frozen. Armed police, artillery, capital garrison, special brigade, investigation, and special police. More and more legions appeared. The military seemed to have an unimaginable big hand. It reached out in the heavy rain with unparalleled power and covered the entire Yuzhou City at once. It was sharp enough to destroy everything. At the same time. In several places near the sea, such as Dongshan and Longjiang, a larger army was gathering. The planes took off, the tanks roared, and the bullets were loaded. The tides rose and fell in the sea at night. In several military ports, the sound of warships began to roar and turn. All the way to the north. The north was Beihai. Beihai Province. The sharp and power that was enough to destroy everything surged unscrupulously in the entire Zhongzhou state, covering the sky, passing through the deep sea, and destroying everything. In the study of the hidden dragon sea, Summer Solstice, who had been silent for a long time, finally couldn't help but speak. Her smile disappeared completely, and her whole person became extremely cold. He looked at Dongqing Wudi. Dongqing Wudi was still calm and collected. Are you crazy? Summer Solstice's voice sounded in the silent book. The room seemed a little sharp. Do you still know what your surname is? Dongqing Wudi suddenly said. Summer Solstice was stunned. Of course my surname is Xia, and also Wang. Wang Summer Solstice. Dongqing Wudi repeated it and nodded. It sounds like a name of Zhongzhou state. Summer Solstice looked at him as if he were a madman. Zhongzhou state people should do what Zhongzhou state people should do. Dongqing Wudi looked at Summer Solstice and said lightly, I don't want to name names or say anything, because you know everything. He took out a cigarette, lit it, and said slowly, Mrs. Wang, the Wang family of Beihai has its bottom line, and I have mine. He reached out and pointed to Li Tianlan, who was constantly struggling on the screen. This hand was very powerful. In an instant, Dongqing Wudi changed from the executive minister of the army headquarters of Zhongzhou state to the invincible Zhongzhou state god of massacre who had been powerful abroad. This is my son-in-law. Dongqing Wudi said calmly, I don't care what method you use. I don't care who you inform, and I don't care what happens tonight, but he has to live. Are you reasonable? Summer Solstice's face was completely red with excitement. Dongqing Wudi smiled and smoked. I don't have the habit of reasoning with women. You can think about it. Dongqing Wudi stared at Summer Solstice like a beast. I don't know how long Tianlan can hold on, but it only takes 3 hours from Zhongzhou state to Beihai. During this time, if you can't give me an explanation, I'll give you one. Summer Solstice's face changed. It was fast to travel from Zhongzhou state to Beihai. But if it was a large number of troops, it would be very slow. In 3 to 5 hours, they had to fight across the sea. During this time, if Li Tianlan died, when Dongqing Wudi's army arrived at Beihai, it would be a war. A war without suspense. Dongqing Wudi's army could not win. But once the war broke out, the Wang family of Beihai would not win either. Once Beihai and the army headquarters of Zhongzhou state became sworn enemies, how could the Wang family of Beihai gain a foothold in Zhongzhou state in the future? And once the war broke out, how could the Southeast group deal with itself? Perhaps there was no need to deal with itself. A large number of troops in Yuzhou city had already gone to the place where the backbone of the Wang family of Beihai, such as the Qin family and the Yi family were. Do you know what this means? Summer Solstice looked at Dongqing Wudi and said calmly, you will die, and everyone in the Dongqing family will die because of your decision. Dongqing Wudi's eyes flashed with coldness, and he said in a gloomy tone, so what? Once the war breaks out, the Dongqing family will be destroyed, and the Wang family of Beihai will be no better. If we can't fight, we will die together. Today, I will play with your Wang family of Beihai with my life. Do you dare? He pulled his military uniform and said with a sneer, you've been breaking the rules. If I don't play with you seriously, I'm really afraid that you don't even know what your surname is. At the same time, the fighting outside the battlefield of Reki City was still going on. The elites of the Snowdance Corps, which had become fewer and fewer, were crazily attacking the formation of Rothschild and the Eastern Church. The most elite warriors of Zhongzhou state fell one by one, in batches. But the entire Snowdance Corps had gone completely crazy. They wanted to rush into the center of the battlefield, regardless of life and death and sacrifice. The elites of the men in black in the fantasy world were getting fewer and fewer. The elites of the Vatican were also demoralized with the escape of Mellad and Arsis. The army of Wulan state rushed up under the cruel military order. They still had the most people so far. But several members of the devil troop were like war machines that lived to kill these people. The red light kept flashing in the crowd. Wherever the gaze of the devil's eye fell, blood would rise in the next second. The morale of the Knights of Light, the elites of Rothschild, the elites of the Morton family, and even the elites of the Violet family could be said to be high. Everyone's eyes were completely bloodshot. They desperately rushed and killed in the crowd, desperately weakening their opponents. The wind and rain became more and more violent. The night was getting darker. Countless rays of light suddenly lit up in the gradually silent night. The wind and rain suddenly became chaotic. Bright and subtle rays of light came from all directions. Under the wind and rain, extremely heavy footsteps suddenly sounded on the chaotic battlefield. The footsteps were heavy and violent, and the speed was extremely fast. In just a few seconds, a few silent and fierce figures appeared at the end of the block. The white light was their eyes. Or rather, it was their gaze. Whoosh! Above the sky, the heavy rain and the night sky seemed to be completely torn apart at the same time. Under the great power, an arrow broke the sky in an instant and fell directly into the crowd of the Knights of Light. The body of a commander of the Knights of Light shook violently, and he lowered his head in astonishment. But before he could see his injury clearly, his whole body had been shot into a mass of flesh and blood. The arrow light passed through his body and smashed a group of elites of the Knights of Light in an instant. Then the great power slowly disappeared. The crowd was silent for a moment. No one knew who shouted first. "It's the string of rainstorm. The string of rainstorm. One of the 4 spirits armors of Zhongzhou State, exclusive to Vermilion Bird." Boom! In another direction, a large piece of sword light suddenly rose to the sky. The sword light was vigorous and piercingly cold. It smashed everything in the whistling, like a storm flying. 24 moves of sword. And there were 24 moves of sword. One of the sword light belonged to Lin Yuxian, the young master of the Lin clan. The other sword light belonged to Li Wangsheng, the lieutenant general of Black Tortoise of Zhongzhou State. Amidst the chaotic battlefield, a white-clothed middle-aged man appeared in front of a demon. For the first time, the invincible devil troop showed a little hesitation. Gong Sun Chi, who was dressed in white, glanced at him and raised his eyebrows. "Do you know me?" The devil did not speak, but the red light in his eyes was flashing rapidly. "If you know me, don't move." Gong Sun Chi reached out and patted the devil's face. With a cold smile, he said, "If you move, I'll kill you." Apex. Chapter 520. The Dark World had always been big. But there had never been many Invincible Realm experts. So most of the time, almost all Invincible Realm experts had karma. Karma was also a fetter. If a person had no fetter, he would naturally become a lonely ghost. Without fear, an Invincible Realm expert would become a powerful lonely ghost. Before the chaos in Eastern Europe broke out, there were 3 Invincible Realm experts on the divine list in Eastern Europe. Patriarch Hostile. His fetter was the Eastern Church. Tyrant. His fetter was the Polar Ground Alliance. Lagos Morton. His fetter was the Morton family. But now, Li Tianlan told Lagos that the Morton family was destroyed. The moment he heard the news, Lagos suddenly realized a problem. Tonight, the battlefield in Reki City was extremely tragic. Several Invincible Realm experts died. The casualties of the thunder-shocking realm experts were countless. But from beginning to end, he had never seen any high-level member of the Snowdance Corps. Some important figures of the Snowdance Corps were famous even in the entire Dark World. Li Zhonghu of the Border Control Corps. Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud of Sai City. The Yin and Yang Phantom of Mount Shu. The Sword Justice and First Elder of Jade Pool. None of these people showed up. Lagos had no doubts. Since he heard the news announced by Li Tianlan, he knew where the high-level members of the Snowdance Corps had gone. When he, Violet, and Hostile rushed to Reki City from their headquarters, the high-level members of the Snowdance Corps actually took the elites to their lair while they were away. This was an extremely crazy plan. But Lagos believed it was true. Because Li Tianlan was a madman. And at this time, it was meaningless for him to say some false news to provoke him. So the Morton family was really destroyed. It was destroyed in the hands of the high-level members of the Snowdance Corps. An indescribable rage and resentment completely filled Lagos's mind. His eyes were red, and his blood was boiling in his body. He had completely lost his mind, and all his attacks fell on Li Tianlan. He would not kill him so easily. This man had destroyed his family. He wanted him to live a life worse than death. Crack, crack, the great power was mighty. Li Tianlan's ribs were broken one by one. The tremendous force was tearing every inch of his muscles and bones bit by bit. His face was pale and his muscles were contorted. But under the tremendous force, he still tried to stand up again and again. The real and illusory sword intent rose and fell around Li Tianlan, and the great power and wind and rain could never erase that glimmer of sharpness. He still wanted to stand up. They still had to attack. Even if he didn't have the slightest ability to retaliate. His head pushed up against Lagos's foot. Lagos stepped on it again and again expressionlessly. Li Tianlan's consciousness began to blur. His hands were tightly gripping the pair of feet in front of him. His feet stood motionless in front of Li Tianlan. Do you know what your biggest mistake was? Morton's cold and twisted voice sounded beside his ear. That is, you destroyed my family, but you don't have the ability to destroy me. As long as I'm here, the Morton family will not disappear. I will not kill you so easily. I will destroy everything related to you. Was the Li family that great? Look, you, the heavenly son of the Li family, are nothing under my feet. Tomorrow, I will go to Zhongzhou State. I want you and the Li family to kneel in front of me like dogs. You will become the shame of the whole Zhongzhou State and the laughingstock of the world. You asked for it. Bang! Lagos raised his foot and kicked Li Tianlan far away. In the cracking sound, the ribs in his chest had been completely broken. His consciousness was blurred and his breathing became difficult. But there was still a pair of feet in front of him. The pair of feet seemed to fly up with him and then landed on the ground. Li Tianlan was in a trance. He exerted a little force in his palm to make sure that it was really a real thing. Cough, cough, the heavy rain fell on the ground, and the dirty rain poured into his mouth with the taste of blood. He coughed violently and spat out more blood. His body struggled slightly and he wanted to stand up. If you continue to be brave, you will die. A calm voice suddenly sounded. It was faint and a little distant, but compared with the wind and rain and killing intent, this voice had a touch of warmth. Who is it? Li Tianlan asked. His mouth was full of blood, and his voice was extremely vague. At most, you can stand up 2 more times, and Lagos will destroy the foundation of your whole body. After that, even if you can live, you have no hope of being invincible, and you can't even touch martial arts. Are you willing? The voice continued to sound. He had never been able to suppress his voice. But neither Lagos nor Paul heard his voice, nor did they see him. He stood there, extremely illusory and perfect. There was no reality at all. Who is it? Li Tianlan's voice was weak and hoarse, and he still asked the same question. Why don't you run? The voice asked calmly, you had a chance to leave before. If you left here, you could have left without going back to Zhongzhou State. With your aptitude, it is very likely that you will reach the top of the divine list within 10 years. Why do you want to die here? Stupid and cowardly. Li Tianlan laughed. His voice was low, and he was panting rapidly. He was vague and extremely hoarse. I can run. He panted. I have time. But what about the Li family? What about my Li family? His smile was bleak, but with a kind of persistence that he would rather die than give up. I have time, but my Li family doesn't. He would rather die than give up. He did not dare to give up. He clenched his fist and hammered the ground hard. The ground splashed with tiny raindrops, making him look even dirtier and more embarrassed. This is Reki City, the Lee family's Reki City, that I conquered. How can I run? Everyone can run. Tell me, how can I run? He was now the youngest invincible realm expert in the dark world. His martial arts were extremely perfect. He was the youngest marshal in the special warfare system of Zhongzhou State. The dark world even recognized that he would become the future chosen one. He had friends in Zhongzhou State who could share life and death with him, seniors who were willing to take risks for him, and tens of thousands of soldiers who were willing to die for him. He even had the most beautiful woman in the dark world. He had a bright future and a respected status. But until now, he still couldn't help but recall his childhood. He had no childhood when he was young. There was only the Lee family. The Lee family that was so stuffy that it made people desperate. The Lee family that was so oppressive in the cemetery that it made people breathless. The Lee family that could even eat a good meal could be said to be a dream. The Lee family that was incomparably broken and no longer had any glory and light. The Lee family that a group of people persisted without complaint or regret. They were silent, but they were willing to support him and his grandfather with everything. He was with that group of people every day. He was in a precarious situation. They were like a group of wild dogs. Li Tianlan suddenly felt extremely guilty. He didn't feel that he was shouldering too much and too heavy a burden. His surname was Li. This was something he should bear. But he really felt guilty. Because he couldn't fulfill his promise after all and didn't let the Li family return to the peak. Countless hopes were all lost at this moment. He ruined all of this. Li Tianlan lay in the rain, his body trembling. Blood and tears mixed in the dirty rain and completely merged. He thought that his will was invincible and he could bear everything. It turned out that when he was really in a desperate situation, he was still a little weak. The light of the future began to gradually become dark. In a blur, all of his confidence seemed to have been completely crushed. It turned into guilt, weakness, confusion, and tears. His palms were tightly clasped together, and his body kept trembling. He stood in front of him, lowered his head, and looked at the child who didn't dare to make a sound even if he cried. 22 years old. He was indeed a child. His eyes were calm, but they were extremely heavy. This kind of heavy weight was borne by the child. For many years, many things, and many situations, he had gritted his teeth and endured it. He was extremely calm and extremely crazy. Only when the child really couldn't bear it did the weight completely collapse at once. Such a collapse was so violent that all the weight seemed to be on him at once. So he also thought of the small mountain village on the border of Zhongzhou State. He thought of what some of his brothers had told him. They were like a group of wild dogs. He suddenly smiled and took a step back. The lights in Reki City were hazy, and the heavy rain was pouring down. He turned his head and looked in the direction of the office of the president. The office of the president was calm. There was no mighty sword light that was 10,000 meters long. The eyes of Paul and King Tong were still cruel. He was silent for a while. He knew what was happening in Zhongzhou State. He also knew what summer solstice would think. So he didn't believe that summer solstice would not call Wang Tianzong in such a situation. But Wang Tianzong still remained silent. He knew what Wang Tianzong was thinking. It was like Wang Tianzong knew what he was thinking. He didn't make a move, but he was forcing Wang Tianzong to make a move. Wang Tianzong didn't make a move, but he was forcing him to make a move. Wang Tianzong wanted to force him to make this sword move. His best sword move. So he laughed again. The weight was on him. What could he do with this sword move? In the final battle, the peak was not there, and the sword intent was not enough. What could he do? So he took another step back. This is what you should bear. You solve it yourself. He spoke slowly in an indifferent tone. Li Tianlan didn't speak. His body struggled to get up again. But the great pain and weakness made him fall in the rain again. "Stand up," he said calmly. "This is your own failure. No one will turn the tables for you." Li Tianlan gritted his teeth and stood up little by little, but he was still wobbling. An incomparably illusory sword energy appeared quietly and wrapped Li Tianlan up. Li Tianlan's body shook violently. This kind of sword intent was so familiar, like the most instinctive feeling. He turned his head and looked ahead. At this moment, he finally saw the other party's face clearly. It was a very ordinary face. It was very ordinary, but it was not real. It became extremely illusory. "It's you," Li Tianlan said softly. The sword intent completely wrapped his body. His aura was extremely restrained, but it forcibly stabilized his injury. His realm did not break through the invincible realm. But with the help of this sword intent, his combat capability began to soar wildly in an instant. Invincible realm. Stabilizing the invincible realm. Close to the peak of the invincible realm. Peak of the invincible realm. Peak of the invincible realm. An unprecedented feeling rose in Li Tianlan's heart. An unimaginably vast and majestic sword chi revolved around him. This was the real top sword energy at the peak of the invincible realm. This sword energy was extremely docile, only waiting for the perfect sword intent of his own martial arts to cooperate. Li Tianlan's eyes were a little dazed, and he didn't even dare to move again. At this moment, he couldn't imagine how powerful he was. It seemed that as long as he raised his hand, he could easily tear the whole sky. "Why?" Li Tianlan suddenly asked. He looked at the man in front of him as if he had seen the whole purgatory. Purgatory of heaven capital. "Deity. You're right about one thing," Deity said indifferently. "No matter who the Li family belongs to in the future, Eastern Europe should belong to the Li family." This was the place he had not conquered back then. This was the place where he was forced to compromise back then. The Li family was stubborn. He had fought here back then, so this place naturally belonged to him and the Li family. No matter who the Li family belonged to. This place could only belong to the Li family. "Get them all out." Deity pointed at the 5 invincible realm experts in front of Li Tianlan and said casually. Li Tianlan laughed. His face was dirty. But the perfect sword intent was ready to move. The mighty sword intent whistled up and down. He stood in the center, but there was a kind of unparalleled elegance. Li Tianlan closed his eyes. Everything around him seemed to be in his perception. He sensed the twilight of the gods was ready to move. He sensed the slight tremble of falling stars. Li Tianlan needed a sword. But it was not falling stars. He opened his eyes, looked at the place of the office of the president, and reached out his hand. "Your Majesty, please lend me your sword." His voice was very soft and did not echo between heaven and earth. But at the same time, the entire office of the president suddenly trembled violently. Every house was shaking. The wind and rain suddenly became chaotic. An indescribable mighty sword intent covered the office of the president in an instant. In Wang Tianzong's room, listen to the sea shook violently, and the sword energy was awe-inspiring. Wang Tianzong, who was drinking tea, suddenly smiled and did not stop anything. In the next second, a bright light flashed across the room. Listen to the sea suddenly came out of its sheath. The blade pierced the window lattice, cut through the wind and rain, and rushed straight to the battlefield. Lagos had rushed over. He said that he would make Li Tianlan's life worse than death. Then he couldn't stand still. For a long time to come, he would make Li Tianlan kneel in front of him or lie down in front of him. Until the Li family was completely destroyed. Bang, bang, bang. Lagos ran with big strides. The rain splashed under his feet. The whole battlefield seemed to be trembling under his feet. He was getting closer and closer to Li Tianlan. He jumped directly into the sky, as if he wanted to step Li Tianlan into the ground again. Li Tianlan glanced at him. A sword light came from the distant sky, as fast as lightning. like a meteor. Li Tianlan raised his hand and played it down. But Lagos's figure suddenly froze in the air. Lagos's pupils suddenly contracted, and his face was full of disbelief, which soon turned into fear. There was silence between heaven and earth. Thunder was about to roar. Death was coming. The perfect sword intent spread out. Li Tianlan's palms suddenly burst out an extremely dazzling sword light. The sword light was magnificent and vast, clear and dazzling, real and illusory, extremely perfect. The sword light bloomed in front of Li Tianlan and went straight into the sky in an instant, mighty and mighty. The 10,000-meter-long sword intent tore the sky in an instant, roaring like a dragon. From the ground to the clouds, the sword light passed through Lagos's body. Puff! Without any suspense, Lagos's body completely burst into a blood mist in the Jian Guangxia, leaving nothing. The sword light in the distance pierced the night sky. Li Tianlan's hand continued to rise and finally held the sword. Listen to the sea. Apex. Chapter 521. Thunder suddenly roared. Death came crashing down. The sword light that went straight into the starry sky from the ground was like a wild dragon, vast and infinite. In an instant, it became the most dazzling light in the whole city. Lagos's body collapsed under the sword energy and melted quickly in the sword light. Blood, broken bones, and even hair turned into dust, scattered in the wind and rain, and finally disappeared without a trace. Li Tianlan looked down at Listen to the Sea in his hand. Listen to the Sea shone with clear light, docile and sharp. This sword was supreme in the Wang family of Beihai. It was also supreme in the dark world. It was just like his current combat capability. His sword intent had been extremely perfect, and the only thing he lacked was the sword energy. Deity helped him make up for the most fatal shortcoming. At this moment, Li Tianlan went straight to the peak of the invincible realm with the foundation of the Chosen One. In today's dark world, he was indeed supreme. The Chosen One was supreme. He was not the Chosen One yet, but with the sword energy at the peak of the invincible realm, only Wang Tianzong was qualified to stand side by side with him in the whole dark world. Li Tianlan looked at Listen to the Sea in his hand and was silent for a while. Listen to the Sea was the most famous sword in the dark world. He could feel the sharpness of Listen to the Sea, but vaguely, it seemed that something was missing and something was suppressed. This feeling was subtle, but it was crucial. Because at this moment, his sword intent and sword energy were too strong, so even the first famous sword in the dark world could not make his sword intent fully exert. How do you feel? Deity's voice was clear and light. He stood beside Li Tianlan, but he did not appear in front of anyone else. The space within dozens of centimeters around him turned into nothingness with him, perfectly merging with the night. Wang Tianzong needs to change a sword. Li Tianlan suddenly said. Deity's sword energy appeared beside Li Tianlan without reservation and slowly merged with his sword intent. The sword energy and sword intent of the same origin merged very smoothly. This also made Li Tianlan's combat capability soar to an incredible level, temporarily becoming the top expert at the peak of the invincible realm. In this way, Li Tianlan's realm was slightly lower than Wang Tianzong's. But Wang Tianzong's sword intent was also slightly lower than Li Tianlan's. In this state, as long as deity did not withdraw the sword intent, Li Tianlan could fight with Wang Tianzong. In other words, Li Tianlan's sword was more powerful than deity himself. Listen to the Sea could not bear his sword intent. Naturally, it could not bear Wang Tianzong's sword intent either. He suddenly remembered Qin Weibai's words. Qin Weibai said that she would give him a sword that could match his future. If such a sword really existed, it would definitely surpass Listen to the Sea. Did the Wang family of Beihai have a sword more terrifying than Listen to the Sea? He was in a trance. He didn't even care about Paul and King Tong, who were a little stunned. He looked at God and suddenly spoke seriously. I suddenly feel like a beggar. You want to borrow sword Qi, and you want to borrow swords? Is it funny? Deity was silent for a moment. You carry a lot of things on your back, he said, but you're not the only one who bears a lot of burdens. What happened tonight, after all, is the Li family's own business. In Lin and in Eastern Europe. Both Li Honghe and Lin Fengting said the same thing. Deity said the same thing to Li Tianlan. The Li family was stubborn. Stubbornness was also pride. So he never thought about the lack of sword energy when facing Wang Tianzong in the final battle. That was why he hadn't shown up before and waited until all the Invincible Realm experts had left the battlefield. Therefore, even though he knew that Wang Tianzong would take action at the last minute because of Zhongzhou State, he still lent the sword energy to Li Tianlan. The army headquarters of Zhongzhou State would give up all actions because of this incident. God does not need this. Because it was the Li family's own business. Was it necessary to use the sword of Beihai to deal with the Li family's affairs? Deity glanced at Listen to the Sea and said calmly, "This sword cannot be used." "Then I'll give up," Li Tianlan said calmly. He turned around, leaving his back to Paul and King Tong, and looked in the direction of the office of the president. King Tong's eyes moved. The next second, Li Tianlan gently flicked his fingers. "Thank you, Your Majesty." Buzz. Between the heavens and the earth, a buzzing sound suddenly rang out under the torrential rain. Near the battlefield, several Rothschild elites had surrounded dozens of members of the Snowdance Corps and were ready to kill them. A buzzing sound rang out. Listen to the Sea flew out. The rainbow streaked across the sky. In an instant, it was earth-shattering. The sword light instantly burst out on the blade of Listen to the Sea. Listen to the Sea cut through the air, and an extremely deep crack suddenly appeared on the ground of Reki City. The crack moved forward crazily with the shooting of the sword light. The roads were collapsing, and the buildings were collapsing. The gravel, the smoke, the spilling blood, the misty lights, and the wind and rain in the sky were all driven by this sword, which was vigorous and vigorous. The elites of Rothschild, who were just about to make a move, were brushed by the sword light, and several elites instantly burst into a mist of blood. The sword light was still moving forward, getting higher and higher. The bright sword light was constantly lengthening in the air, and its speed had reached the limit. The whole city was roaring. The deep cracks on the ground moved forward crazily with the sword light. It was hundreds of meters, thousands of meters, and thousands of meters. Boom! The sword light passed through the tall buildings of Reki City. On the ground, the ordinary shops were torn apart by the spreading cracks. Everything was driven down by the smoke and dust. The sword light that was thousands of meters long was still flying endlessly. The cracks were still spreading, tearing the roads and shattering the blocks. The crazy sword energy lifted everything up, brought it into the air, and covered the sky. Paul looked at the sword quietly. His eyes were filled with horror. His breath was full of despair. An unimaginable sharp edge was raging wildly in Reki City. The sword energy was 10,000 meters long. The sky was full of sword light. The office of the president was shaking like never before. The sword light drove heaven and earth, as if a real and illusory world was rumbling over. This sword was only ruthless. This sword was only swift and fierce. This sword was only arrogant. Wang Tianzong stood in front of the window and calmly looked at the 10,000-meter-long sword light that almost tore half of Reki City apart in an instant. He looked around and reached the sky, tracing back time to eternity. It was all real. It was all illusory. It was all a sword strike. It was as fierce as the west wind. The sword light tore the square in front of the office of the president. The star flag of Zhongzhou State was fluttering in front of the square. The ground was constantly being torn apart. The huge crack spread from 10,000 meters away with the sword light and directly hit the office of the president. That ruthless and extremely arrogant sharpness had finally arrived. The majestic and heavy office of the president was completely torn apart in an instant. The sword light shattered the gate, the garden, the rockery, and stirred up a pool of water in the office of the president. The water light all over the sky brought about a pervasive mist. This sword directly arrived in front of Wang Tianzong. The sword light was vast, like the starry sky and the world. Real and illusory were constantly changing. It was ethereal. It was invincible. The sword light was like a mountain or a sea. In front of the sword light, Wang Tianzong's figure was like a star or dust. Wang Tianzong stood motionless in front of the window. He reached out his hand. In an instant, the aura on his body was directly restrained to the extreme. His palm glowed. It was subtle and hazy. The listen to the sea sword rushed over. He reached out and flicked. Endless power burst out in an unimaginable way in an instant. The spreading crack stopped in front of Wang Tianzong's room in an instant. The sword light stopped for a moment, and the endless edge suddenly began to retreat as if pushed by something. Countless rays of light withdrew from the office of the president and completely exploded in the square in front of the office of the president. The power was surging and sweeping everything away. The square, which was enough to support the military parade of Wulan State, was completely destroyed in an instant. 10,000 meters away, Li Tianlan's whole arm was instantly bleeding. Wang Tianzong held the blade of listen to the sea and put the long sword back into the scabbard expressionlessly. He walked back to the room, sat down, and poured himself a cup of tea. But all he could think about was the warning meaning contained in this sword strike. Blood flowed down his cuffs. It dyed his sleeves and wet the table. Wang Tianzong seemed to be unaware of it. He picked up the teacup and took a sip. The tea was cold. It was slightly bitter. It was. Chapter 522. Li Tianlan lowered his head and looked at his arm. The blood turned into countless tiny blood vessels and sprayed out like a small fountain in the night. His arm trembled slightly, but his eyes were extremely calm. He and Wang Tianzong were only a little short of perfection. Judging from the result, Li Tianlan was slightly at a disadvantage, but the slight gap was almost negligible. With the help of deity's sword energy. This was the first time he stood at the top of the whole world. It was also the first time he fought with the top figure in the dark world. It seemed that it was not until this time that his state of mind really sublimated to the peak state with this sword. This sword had no respect for anyone. This sword was insufferably arrogant. Under the sword light, his will could wreak havoc in the dark world unscrupulously. That feeling could only be described with the simplest word. Invincible. The invincible realm was invincible. The sword light 10,000 meters away was still roaring and surging. The office of the president was completely overturned. The huge square in front of the office of the president was broken. The huge force almost flattened the entire block near the office of the president in an instant, and finally slowly dissipated. Li Tianlan looked into the distance and said calmly, "Thank you." Deity stood beside Li Tianlan and said lightly, "Thank you." If he joined forces with him, they would represent the currently family. If he joined forces with him, they would be invincible in the world. Under the heavy rain, the sword intent and sword energy of the two completely merged. Deity saw Li Tianlan's martial arts clearly. Li Tianlan also saw Deity's martial arts clearly. This earth-shattering sword not only tested Wang Tianzong's attitude, but also let Li Tianlan see his future path. Vaguely, he seemed to really touch the threshold of how to step into the invincible realm in the most perfect posture. The road was ahead. It was very far. He needed time. He took a step forward. He looked at Paul, at Charlemagne, at King Tong, and at Hastile. Lagos had fallen. The faces of the remaining 4 invincible realm experts were extremely ugly. The 4 of them had completely lost control of their emotions, with embarrassment, shock, and fear. All the emotions were expressed on their faces. Li Tianlan moved forward slowly. After that earth-shattering strike, his eyes calmed down. Perhaps no one knew why he fought with Wang Tianzong first. However, In that sword light that was enough to tear apart the heavens and the earth, he had obtained many answers. Answers about the present, the future, himself, and his enemies. His eyes became even more tranquil and deep like an ocean, without any undulations, yet incomparably vast. King Tong stared at Li Tianlan's footsteps. Her face was a little pale. The corners of Hastiel's mouth twitched slightly as he muttered something to himself. Charlemagne clutched the twilight of the gods in his hand and said nothing. Paul suddenly glanced at Li Tianlan, then looked behind Li Tianlan and asked, "Who's there?" It was impossible for Li Tianlan to suddenly become so strong. The only explanation was that a real expert lent his sword energy to Li Tianlan for the time being. He was the expert closest to the peak of the invincible realm in the dark world. However, he was also powerless to resist the sword light just now. So his expression was calm, but his voice was trembling. No one spoke. Li Tianlan kept walking forward. "What do you want?" Paul looked at Li Tianlan, and his expression suddenly became extremely sincere. "Maybe we can talk." "You should have killed me just now," Li Tianlan said. Of course, he wanted to talk. But he didn't want to talk with his mouth. He raised his palm. There was another buzz between heaven and earth. But there was no sword intent. In an instant, the rain in the whole block was swept away. The sky was silent, and the huge sword intent occupied the field. It seemed to fall from the sky, but it also seemed to rise from the ground. The falling rain disappeared, and the starlight fell. The starry sky also fell. The whole world was dead silent in an instant. The sky and the earth pressed down at the same time, irresistible. There was no sword energy in this sword strike. Because the sky, the earth, and all directions had turned into swords. It was a pure, integral sword. Hastiel's face was distorted. He seemed to be roaring something, but there was no sound. Paul's expression changed dramatically. Charlemagne raised the muzzle of his gun. King Tong was screaming. But everything was extremely silent. With one sword strike, the world was silent forever. Li Tianlan raised his palm and put his fingers together like a sword. In the absolute silence, Paul took a step forward. King Tong stood beside him. Charlemagne and Hastiel moved forward. Shadows filled the air. The light lit up. The domains of the four people were overlaid crazily, and then they began to gather to the limit. At this moment, Li Tianlan could fight against Wang Tianzong with his sword. Li Tianlan couldn't resist this. They were no longer thinking about fighting, but how to get out of Li Tianlan's hands. Snowdance Corps, Dark Nights, Retreat. Li Tianlan's voice suddenly sounded. In the absolute silence, his voice was loud and majestic, becoming the only voice. The domains of the four invincible realm experts overlapped and condensed into a ball of light that could just wrap them up. The ball of light flickered, extremely thick and smooth. This was the strongest defensive means of the four people now, and they didn't hold back at all. Li Tianlan was expressionless. He had no sword in his hand. But his sword-like fingers moved forward slightly. Endless light fell from the sky, light and ethereal, but extremely magnificent. All the light gathered at Li Tianlan's fingertips. The starlight all over the sky turned into a beam of light in his hand, like sword light. The sword light stabbed the ball of light in front of the four invincible realm experts. The smooth ball of light suddenly wrinkled, like ripples on the water, spreading layer by layer. The sword light froze for a moment. Li Tianlan's eyes suddenly lit up, and his sword intent turned. There was a roar everywhere between heaven and earth. The mountains and rivers were no longer silent and began to break. The 21st blade shatter of land. The mountain-like sword light surged over. Li Tianlan's body was glowing, extremely dazzling. Everything nearby was shrouded by the sword light. The sword light occupied the sky and the ground. The whole battlefield was as bright as day in an instant. Behind Li Tianlan, Deity's pupils suddenly contracted. Looking at this sword, his eyes were filled with relief, killing intent, pain, and incomparably complicated. Li Tianlan's sword was neither real nor illusory, but it was also flawless. When the day was extremely bright, it became night. Day and night alternated in an instant. The sword light in Li Tianlan's hand completely burst out in an instant. Boom! The domains condensed and superimposed by the 4 invincible realm experts were instantly shattered. The huge domain spread and exploded. It stirred up heaven and earth. In the endless turbulence of power, Li Tianlan walked inexpressionlessly. So indifferent, so majestic. Ah, 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 ah. Hastiel's heart seemed to have completely collapsed. His white robe flew up, and the blazing white light began to bloom all over his body. The light of heaven was burning on him. It was burning all his strength and potential. His face was distorted, and with crazy killing intent, he rushed over like a glowing cannonball. Li Tianlan glanced at him. His eyes were silent. But 4 streaks of sword energy appeared at the same time in the 4 directions of north, south, east, and west. The sword energy fell from the sky with starlight and turned into 4 natural arcs of light. The arcs of light pulled heaven and earth. In a flash, they arrived in front of Hastiel almost in an instant. The 4 sword intents crossed each other. Bang! The invincible realm expert with the strongest combat capability in the Eastern Church. The domain of the invincible realm expert, who was known as the #1 expert in Eastern Europe, was completely shattered. 4 streaks of sword light crisscrossed and directly cut Hastiel's body into 4 pieces. The blood of the mutilated body splashed in all directions. Li Tianlan didn't stop and continued to move forward. King Tong's whole body began to tremble violently. Another invincible realm expert died. One move. Insta-kill. For anyone, this was the most impactful picture. Under the sword light, even the invincible realm experts on the divine list were like nonentities. Who had ever seen such a picture? The dark world was in constant disputes, but compared to the current general trend, it had been calm for many years. King Tong had never seen an invincible realm expert killed in one move. Paul had never seen it. Charlemagne had never seen it either. They knew that Wang Tianzong could do it, but they had never seen it. It wasn't until this picture really appeared in front of them that the impact was fully reflected at once. It was extreme fear and despair. We are willing to admit defeat, Paul suddenly said. He looked at Li Tianlan with cold eyes. Rothschild will withdraw from Eastern Europe, which is good for everyone. Their ally had already fallen tonight. What was the point of staying here? Li Tianlan still didn't stop. He kept moving forward, and he was less than 10 meters away from Paul. The space kept twisting as he walked. He fought with Wang Tianzong, killed Lagos, and killed Hastiel. The sword energy had weakened. But the sword intent was still perfect. Don't move. A ray of dim yellow light suddenly enveloped Li Tianlan's body completely. The dim yellow color kept swimming around him. The dim light was changing slightly, and it was blurry. Li Tianlan stopped where he was, looked at Charlemagne, and narrowed his eyes. Please calm down, Your Highness. How about sparing my life? The muzzle of the Twilight of the Gods was pointed at Li Tianlan. Charlemagne looked at Li Tianlan seriously, and his tone was completely low and humble as he begged. Li Tianlan looked at him without speaking or moving forward. I'm willing to kill King Tong for Your Highness. Tonight, you and I are allies. If Your Highness is willing to let me go, the Heroes Club will be Your Highness's ally forever from now on. Charlemagne spoke with sincerity. Are you done? Li Tianlan said blandly. Charlemagne froze for a moment, and his face was cloudy. Give it to me. Li Tianlan reached out his hand. Charlemagne subconsciously grasped the Twilight of the Gods in his hand, and said with an extremely ugly face, Your Highness, give it to me. Li Tianlan repeated his words. Deity's sword energy was deity after all. However, if he could obtain the twilight of the gods, especially when it was in a charged state, the significance of it was self-evident. Charlemagne took a step forward subconsciously. Paul narrowed his eyes, but did not move. Charlemagne took another step forward. Li Tianlan looked at him quietly, but did not move. Today, the Heroes Club is willing to offer the twilight of the gods to your highness. Charlemagne came to Li Tianlan, lifted the twilight of the gods horizontally, and lowered his head. Li Tianlan reached out his hand. In an instant, Charlemagne's face suddenly became ferocious. His palm swept across the body of the twilight of the gods. Click. It seemed to be the sound of the bolt being pulled. The entire muzzle of the twilight of the gods suddenly lit up with a dim yellow light. Li Tianlan's palm was about to touch this murderous weapon. Charlemagne's muzzle had turned and was aimed at Li Tianlan's chest. The distance between the two was so close. Less than 2 meters. The murderous weapon opened fire with all its might. Bang! There was a sudden roar between heaven and earth. On the gloomy battlefield, endless dim yellow lights suddenly burst out. It was like the setting sun rising in the sky. Chapter 523. The sun was setting. Down meant that it was falling. But the dim yellow light that exploded all over the sky was rising and flying high into the sky. The boundless killing intent swept over like a raging wave. The light was blurred and flew higher and higher. Bang! Without the slightest hesitation, Charlemagne fired again. The 12 murderous weapons were extremely mysterious. Countless people in the dark world did not know how many shots the twilight of the gods could fire. People only remembered that the twilight of the gods had fired 3 times in a row a long time ago. In fact, this was also the limit of the twilight of the gods. This murderous weapon that could perfectly fit all forces could only fire 3 times at most once it stored energy. Charlemagne seriously injured Arcis with the explosion of the Devil Troop and Paul's attack. And the remaining 2 shots were used on Li Tianlan. The light was like a tide, swallowing Li Tianlan's figure in an instant. The yellow light was whistling, flowing, and rushing. It rushed forward and rolled back. Li Tianlan's position became the center of all the light. The light continued to cover his body. The light forward and the light backward entangled together and flew high into the sky, becoming round like the setting sun. Charlemagne could not see Li Tianlan in the light. However, his expression was extremely ugly, and his eyes were filled with undisguised doubt and fear. 2/3 of the power of the twilight of the gods had burst out incisively and vividly. Although it was 2/3 of the power, this murderous weapon had not been fired for too long. The longer the time to store energy naturally meant more power. The real power of the 2 consecutive shots was no less than that of other murderous weapons. But the twilight of the gods should not be like this. Because its light was rising. Rising meant that it was getting farther and farther away from Li Tianlan. Why was this happening? Charlemagne felt a little incredulous. The dim yellow light kept dancing in front of him and slowly rose. The light of the twilight of the gods seemed to condense in place after the initial outbreak. The destructive power was still there, but at this time it seemed to be suppressed by an invisible force and was frozen in the air. Charlemagne gritted his teeth. He raised the twilight of the gods. The huge gun body rippled with a dim yellow light. The light gradually grew and finally merged with Charlemagne's domain. This murderous weapon was called the Twilight of the Gods. Charlemagne's domain was also called the Twilight of the Gods. The front end of the domain merged into the yellow light in front of Li Tianlan, and at the same time, it also enveloped King Tong and Paul. King Tong and Paul looked at each other. Their shadow domains began to spread at the same time, and finally merged with the Twilight of the Gods. This was the domain of 2 experts who were extremely close to the peak of the invincible realm and 1 expert who was close to the peak of the invincible realm. There were only a few confirmed experts at the peak of the invincible realm in the dark world. Wang Tianzong had surpassed the peak of the invincible realm. He used a sword. Deity of the purgatory of heaven capital was at the peak of the invincible realm. He also used a sword. Lin Fengting was at the peak of the invincible realm and also used a sword. The master of Samsara Palace hovered at the peak of the invincible realm and still used a sword. The current situation of the dark world was the world of swords. Arceus didn't use a sword, but he also didn't need a domain. He was good at close combat. In the entire dark world, the strongest person who chose the path of domain after entering the invincible realm was Gu Xingyun, the god of war of Zhongzhou state. So now that Paul and the other two joined forces, such a domain could be said to be the strongest domain in the dark world. The dim yellow light was still dancing and wreaking havoc. Li Tianlan seemed to be locked by the murderous weapon and did not move. This period of time was both short and long. But for experts of the invincible realm, it was enough for them to complete a real outbreak of all their strength. Without any reservation, the two shadows, which seemed to be solid and almost black, merged with Charlemagne's domain. The strange and heavy power kept surging in Charlemagne's domain. Charlemagne's eyes gradually lit up. His eyes were clear and bright. At this moment, King Tong and Paul lent their strength to him at the same time. Somehow, it seemed to be an illusion. He had broken through the threshold that he had always dreamed of. With a murderous weapon in his hand, he was at the peak of the invincible realm. This was the strongest moment of his life. Charlemagne was full of confidence. The power of the shadow and his own slowly surged in the domain, which was extremely vast. Li Tianlan still didn't move. If you had agreed to my conditions just now, how could you have ended up like this now? Charlemagne looked at Li Tianlan, and his tone was dignified and cold. Li Tianlan didn't respond, and he couldn't. Tonight is your fate. Charlemagne's tone was cold. The overwhelming power was almost boundless, and it kept spreading in his domain. Charlemagne raised his hand as if he were holding a world. This world began to merge with the dim light. Charlemagne walked into the light. The strongest domain in the dark world had completely merged with the murderous weapon. In the dim yellow sky, Charlemagne finally saw Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan gently raised his palm. There was a clear light in front of him. The clear light was like a sword, and it wrapped him up like a ball. All the light hit the ball of light. The surface of the ball of light rippled, and the ripples spread layer by layer. Every ripple was an incomparably perfect sword intent. The sword intent that spread out merged perfectly with the light of the twilight of the gods. The sword intent rose into the sky with the light, getting higher and higher. Li Tianlan closed his eyes. He was calm, and there was a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. Charlemagne suddenly felt extremely cold all over. He opened his eyes wide and froze for a while. Then he suddenly roared, "What are you doing?" His voice was full of surprise and anger. The moment he spoke, Paul's face changed, and he instinctively pulled King Tong back. Li Tianlan took a step forward and whispered, "Don't move." Charlemagne's face turned red and he didn't move. It was not that he didn't dare to move, but the moment he walked in, he really couldn't move at all. A faint but incomparably real sword intent filled every ray of the twilight of the gods. The moment he tried to combine his domain with the twilight of the gods, the sword intent had directly rushed into his domain, like the spring rain moistening the leaves. It was soft and slow, but there was no way to stop it or resist it. All the sword intent completely wrapped Charlemagne's body, which was extremely cold. The domain was enveloped by this seemingly gentle sword intent, silent and undetectable. Charlemagne's face was full of absurdity and disbelief. This sword strike was not earth-shattering. But it was truly all-encompassing. Everyone knew that Li Tianlan's sword intent was perfect. Everyone knew that Li Tianlan was the future chosen one. But no one had seen perfection, and no one had seen the chosen one. To what extent was the perfection of the chosen one? The domain was silently devoured by the sword intent. Li Tianlan took a step forward. Endless clear light danced around him like a dragon, and the power of the twilight of the gods continued to rise into the sky. Li Tianlan's expression was calm. But at this moment, the yellow light and the clear light were entangled. Standing in the center of the light, he was really shining like a god. Charlemagne's eyes were full of horror. Horror turned into despair. Despair turned into madness. Ah, 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 ah. He roared like an injured beast. Wrapped by countless sword intents, the strength of his whole body burst out desperately. In the desperate situation, he forgot about the future and even forgot about life and death. The power that was very close to the peak of the invincible realm surged wildly, like a waterfall that flew straight down, and moved forward with indomitable will. Lightning flashed and thunder roared. Flames rose, and ice condensed. Li Tianlan waved his hand like a sword. The clear light and the dim yellow light fluctuated at the same time. The light collided with Charlemagne's final outburst. At the last moment, Li Tianlan saw Charlemagne's eyes. These were the eyes of the president of the Heroes Club, who was deeply rooted in South America and was influential in the dark world. These were the eyes of the 6th place on the divine list in the dark world. His eyes were full of fear, with great regret and pleading, and there were faint tears in them. He was an absolute expert in the dark world. But in the general trend, he chose the wrong direction. Under the general trend, even the invincible realm was like an ant. An ant who made a mistake could only die. There was a loud roar between heaven and earth. Charlemagne's final outburst of power was driven to the sky by the clear light. The setting sun had already risen high in the sky. Shadow and dusk merged with the clear light. Charlemagne's burning flame seemed to be the most important opportunity, completely igniting the setting sun. The setting sun instantly became fiery red, like the scorching sun. It was like the sun at high noon. Li Tianlan's arm chopped over. Blood splashed everywhere. Charlemagne stood where he was. But his head flew high and was shone into pieces by the light of the scorching sun in the night sky. Li Tianlan's arm was like a sword, but his fingers moved lightly in the air with great agility. It was like making a seal. The expression of deity, who had been standing beside Li Tianlan, changed slightly. He recognized Li Tianlan's seal. This was the Heartless Seal and the Divine Punishment Seal and the Immortality Seal. But the unique skill that belonged to the Purgatory of Heaven capital was completely restored to its essence in Li Tianlan's hands. The essence of the Immortality Seal was a sword. It was the 24 moves of sword. The Heartless Seal. The Divine Punishment Seal. It was the 8th blade and the 9th blade. The 8th blade, burning sky. The 9th blade, dusk. Deity looked at Li Tianlan deeply. The Immortality Seal was his unique skill. But at this moment it was difficult for even him to do what Li Tianlan had done, and he couldn't do it at all. The light but extremely pure sword intent rushed directly to the sky with Li Tianlan's seal. The scorching sun high in the sky kept shaking and shaking. The light trembled in the air. The world was silent. Under everyone's desperate gaze, the scorching sun that occupied the night sky suddenly exploded. The sky was full of flowing fire. Li Tianlan stretched out his palm and suddenly clenched it. The Immortality Seal, all paths of nature. The exploding scorching sun turned into thousands of rays of light. The rays of light were scorching and low, covering down like a sea. Each ray of light was a sword. This sword completely covered the entire battlefield. The falling light fell on the crowd. It bypassed the Snowdance Corps, the Dark Knights, the Terracotta Army, and the Devil Troop. Countless rays of light passed through the Vatican, Rothschild, the Eastern Church, and the chests and glabella of the elites of Morton and the Violet family. Li Tianlan closed his eyes. His world was full of sword light. Every ray of sword light was his sword. The light was scorching, and there was silence. In the absolute silence, there was only death. Countless elites fell down one after another. They opened their mouths to shout, but they could not make any sound. The battlefield became quieter and quieter. It was hopelessly quiet. In the hazy sword intent, Li Tianlan opened his eyes. Paul and King Tong, whose faces were extremely pale, found that even if the sword light disappeared, the whole battlefield was also quiet. The elites of the Snowdance Corps, the Terracotta Army, and the Dark Knights stood where they were in a daze. And in front of them, there were no more opponents. Not a single one. Li Tianlan's face was slightly pale, and his aura gradually weakened. But he was still indifferent. He glanced at Paul and King Tong and said what Paul had once said, "Now, we can have a good time." There were still 5 more Heavenly Suns, and it would be over after 5. You're tuning into the Romantic Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.